November 23, 1859, marked the arrival of Henry McCarty into a world that seemed determined to grind him into dust from the very moment he drew his first breath in the freezing, filth-strewn squalor of New York City's Fourth Ward. The infant who would one day haunt the nightmares of territorial governors and cattle barons alike began his existence at the absolute bottom of the American social hierarchy, born to an Irish immigrant woman named Catherine McCarty in a tenement district where survival was a daily violent lottery. The air in the Fourth Ward was a physical weight, thick with the acrid stench of burning coal, the rot of uncollected garbage, and the raw sewage that flowed openly in the gutters of Cherry Street. It was a claustrophobic universe of brick and cobblestone, where the sun was merely a rumor blocked by the towering warrens that housed thousands of desperate families fleeing the famine across the Atlantic. Catherine McCarty was a woman of iron will, possessing a resilience forged in the fires of hardship. Yet she was already fighting a losing war against the damp, consumption-riddled atmosphere that clung to the city like a shroud. She had no husband to stand beside her, no protector to shield her two sons Henry and Joseph from the predation of the slums, leaving her to navigate the labyrinth of poverty with a fierce, solitary determination. The early years of Henry's life were defined not by the open plains he would later roam, but by the crushing density of the metropolis, a place where the noise never ceased, and the threat of violence hung in the air like humidity. He learned to walk on slick, manure-covered stones and learned to speak in the cadence of the Irish poor, his world limited to the few blocks surrounding their tenement. But the city was killing his mother. The tuberculosis that had seeded itself in her lungs thrived in the wet, cold-choked air of Manhattan, and by the mid-1860s the necessity of escape became undeniable. The family joined the great westward migration, a desperate exodus not for gold or glory but for the simple biological need for breath. They drifted first to Indianapolis, a transition that traded the vertical prisons of New York for the flat, muddy expanse of the Midwest, where the horizon finally opened up and the sky became a dominant feature of their lives. Yet even here, the humidity of the river valleys offered no respite for Catherine's failing health, and the cough that would serve as the grim metronome of Henry's childhood grew louder, a dry, hacking sound that echoed through the thin walls of their rented rooms. By 1870, the family had pushed their way to Wichita, Kansas, a raw, exploding frontier town that vibrated with the kinetic energy of the Chisholm Trail. Wichita was a sensory assault of a different kind, a place where the civilization of the East frayed and snapped under the pressure of the wild. The streets were not paved with stone but were churned into a thick, foul paste of mud and animal waste by the hooves of endless herds of longhorn cattle driven north from Texas. Henry, now a watchful boy with intelligent blue eyes and a slight frame, witnessed the brutality of the West in its most unvarnished form. He saw the drovers, men with sun-blackened skin and eyes hard as flint, riding into town with months of pay in their pockets and a hunger for chaos. He watched from the safety of the wooden sidewalks as arguments were settled with fists and the sudden, terrifying roar of gunfire, the violence erupting with a casual suddenness that shocked him. Catherine, tirelessly working to support her sons, operated a laundry, plunging her hands daily into scalding water and harsh lye soap until her skin was red and cracked, scrubbing the grime from the clothes of the men who were building the frontier. She was a pillar of the community, even signing a petition to incorporate the city, a testament to her desperate desire to build a structured, civilized life for her children amidst the anarchy of the cow town. But the Kansas wind was harsh, filled with grit that scoured the lungs, and the dust aggravated Catherine's condition, forcing the family to uproot once more in search of the dry, healing air of the high desert. They arrived in Santa Fe, New Mexico territory in 1873, a city that felt ancient and alien compared to the wooden shanty towns of the plains. The air here was thin and smelled of burning pinon wood, and the architecture was born of the earth itself, thick adobe walls that kept the interiors cool and dark. It was in this stark, beautiful landscape that Catherine married William Antrim on March 1st, 1873, at the First Presbyterian Church. Antrim was a bearded, taciturn man, a prospector obsessed with the mineral wealth hidden in the mountains, a man who preferred the silence of a drift tunnel to the domestic obligations of a family. He was not cruel, but he was emotionally absent, viewing Henry and Joseph as baggage that accompanied the woman he loved. Henry felt the distance keenly, watching his new stepfather pack his mules and disappear into the hills for weeks at a time, leaving the boy to wonder where he fit in this new, fragmented family unit. The final migration brought them to Silver City in 1874, a rugged mining settlement carved into the heavy hills of Grant County. The town was a hive of industrial activity populated by Cornish miners, Mexican laborers, and American speculators, all tearing into the earth in search of silver. The McCarty-Antrim family moved into a small, rough-hewn cabin, hoping the high altitude would finally arrest the decay in Catherine's lungs. But the disease was a relentless predator, and it had advanced too far to be stopped by thin air or prayers. The tuberculosis consumed her vitality with terrifying speed, reducing the vibrant, strong-willed immigrant woman to a fragile skeleton. Henry became his mother's nurse, spending his days and nights by her bedside, listening to the fluid rattle in her chest and wiping the fever sweat from her brow. The cabin smelled of sickness, of medicinal tonics, and the metallic tang of blood coughed into handkerchiefs. On September 16, 1874, the struggle ended. Catherine McCarty died, drowning in her own fluids as her sons watched the light fade from her eyes. The death of his mother was the seismic event that shattered Henry's world. She had been the moral center of his universe, the disciplinarian, the provider, and the only source of unconditional love he had ever known. Without her, he was unmoored. The funeral was a stark, dusty affair, the pine coffin lowered into the rocky soil of the Silver City Cemetery while Henry stood by, a 15-year-old boy with a hollow ache in his chest. William Antrim, grief-stricken but pragmatic, wasted little time in dismantling the household. He sold the cabin and placed Henry and Joseph in separate living arrangements, absolving himself of the responsibility of raising two stepsons who were not his blood. Henry was boarded with the family of a local butcher named Richard Knight, where he was expected to earn his keep by working in the slaughterhouse. The visceral reality of this work was a grim education for a boy still mourning his mother. He spent his days ankle-deep in blood and offal, surrounded by the squeals of dying animals and the dull thud of the cleaver slicing through bone. The gore hardened his stomach, but the environment was bleak and devoid of affection. Henry eventually left the butcher's employment and found work at the Star Hotel, an establishment run by a man named Truesdell. Here he waited tables and washed dishes in the kitchen, presenting a polite, eager face to the customers. He was small for his age, weighing barely more than 100 pounds, with a boyish charm that made him popular with the locals. They saw him as a victim of circumstance, a good boy who had been dealt a bad hand and was trying to make an honest way in the world. But the nights were long and lonely, and the lack of parental supervision allowed him to drift toward the edges of Silver City's society. He began to explore the saloons and gambling halls, drawn to the lights and the noise like a moth to a flame. It was a world of smoke and whiskey, of loud boasts and easy virtue, and it offered a kind of camaraderie that he desperately craved. It was in this twilight world of the demi-monde that he encountered George Schaefer, a man known to the locals as Sombrero Jack. Schaefer was a shifting, unreliable character, a heavy drinker and a petty thief who drifted through life on a current of bad decisions and cheap liquor. To a lonely, impressionable boy like Henry, however, Schaefer appeared as a figure of intrigue. He was older, he told exciting stories of the road, and he treated Henry like a contemporary rather than a servant. They formed an unlikely pair, the scrawny orphan and the drunken drifter, spending their evenings in the back alleys and cheap dives. Schaefer began to groom the boy, not for a life of high-stakes crime, but for the petty larceny that sustained his own miserable existence. He challenged Henry, mocking his innocence, daring him to cross the line from observer to participant. The slide into criminality was not a dramatic plunge, but a stumble, a single bad decision made in the heat of a moment. It happened in late September 1875, exactly 1 year after Catherine's death. Schaefer, short on cash and too lazy to perform honest labor, devised a plan to rob a Chinese laundry run by a man named Charlie's Son. He pressured Henry to be the active participant, the one to take the physical risk while he kept watch. It was a test of loyalty and nerve. Under the cover of darkness, Henry crept up to the laundry, his heart hammering against his ribs, a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. He found the bundle of clothes, shirts and linens belonging to Mrs. Cohen, the landlady of the boarding house where Schaefer stayed. Henry grabbed the heavy bundle, the fabric rough against his hands, and fled into the night, delivering the prize to Schaefer. The theft was clumsy, amateurish, and immediately discovered. Mrs. Cohen, a woman of formidable temper, went straight to Sheriff Harvey Whitehill. Whitehill was a massive man, a pioneer lawman who governed Silver City with a mix of brute force and paternalism. He knew Henry, and he knew the boy was sliding down a dangerous path. When the stolen clothes were found in the room Henry shared with Schaefer, who had conveniently vanished at the first sign of trouble, Whitehill arrested the boy. He did not cuff him or beat him, he simply walked him to the jail, intending to give him a scare. Whitehill liked Henry. He believed the boy was merely misguided, not malicious. He thought a few nights in the stark reality of the county jail would shock him back to his senses and put him back on the straight and narrow. But for Henry, the experience was not a corrective lesson. It was a profound trauma. The jail was a stone box, cold, damp, and terrifying. As the heavy door clanged shut, locking him in with the town's drunks and hard cases, Henry felt a panic that bordered on hysteria. He was trapped. The authority figures in his life, his father, his stepfather, and now the law, had all failed him or turned against him. He sat on the hard cot, listening to the breathing of the other prisoners, and the walls seemed to close in on him. He decided then and there that he would not be caged. He would not wait for the sheriff's mercy. He studied the cell with the intensity of a trapped animal. The door was solid iron, immovable. The windows were barred with thick steel. But there was a chimney, a narrow, soot-choked shaft that served the heating stove. It was impossibly tight, a dark throat of brick that led up to the roof. Henry waited until the dead of night, when the jailer was asleep and the town was silent. He moved the heavy stove aside, the metal scraping softly against the floor. He looked up into the blackness of the shaft. Taking a deep breath, he squeezed his body into the opening. The space was claustrophobic, pressing in on his chest and back. He dug his boots into the rough bricks and pushed, inching his way upward. The soot filled his nose and mouth, choking him. The rough masonry tore at his clothes and scraped the skin from his elbows and knees. He climbed blindly, fueled by sheer terror and the desperate need for freedom. If he slipped, he would wedge himself tight or fall back into the cell to face the sheriff's wrath. He pushed harder, his muscles burning, until his hand grasped the lip of the chimney stack. He pulled himself out into the cool night air, gasping, covered from head to toe in black dust. He was out. He slid down the roof and dropped into the alley, his boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. He was free, but he was marked. He was no longer just an orphan, he was a fugitive. He fled Silver City that night, running into the darkness of the desert, leaving behind the only home he had and the grave of the only person who had ever loved him. He was 15 years old, alone, and running for his life. He made his way to the outskirts of town, his eyes scanning constantly for the glint of a badge or the silhouette of a lawman. He found a wagon train preparing to depart for Arizona and managed to talk his way into a temporary position, likely offering his labor in exchange for food and safe passage. As the wagons rolled out of Silver City, the wheels grinding against the rocky trail, Henry looked back at the town that had claimed his mother and branded him a thief. He felt a hardening in his chest, a callus growing over the wound of his abandonment. He was leaving behind the grave of Catherine McCarty and the indifference of William Antrim. He was heading into the vast, lawless expanse of the Arizona Territory, a land even harsher and more unforgiving than New Mexico. The journey to Arizona was grueling. The desert stretched out in all directions, a landscape of scrub brush and heat shimmering off the hardpan. Henry walked alongside the oxen, his boots kicking up clouds of alkali dust that coated his throat. He worked for his keep, tending the animals, gathering wood, and doing whatever menial tasks were required. The men on the wagon train were rough sorts, teamsters and drifters who cared little for a runaway boy's past. They accepted him as long as he pulled his weight. During the long nights around the campfire, Henry listened to their talk. They spoke of Apache raids, of gold strikes, and of gunmen who made their own laws. These were the cautionary tales of the frontier, but to Henry, they sounded like a curriculum. He was learning the rules of a new world, one where the law was distant and survival depended on being quicker and smarter than the next man. By the time he crossed the border into Arizona, the physical transformation had begun. The soft features of the city boy were burning away under the desert sun, replaced by the lean, weathered look of a range hand. His hands were calloused from handling ropes and wood. His eyes were constantly moving, reading the terrain, watching for danger. He was still physically slight, often underestimated by those who saw him, but he was developing a resilience that belied his size. He arrived in the vicinity of Camp Grant, a remote military post where civilian contractors mingled with soldiers and the local ecosystem of gamblers and thieves. It was here that he would seek work, hoping to disappear into the anonymity of the frontier labor force. The transition from Henry McCarty to the figure known as the Kid was not a singular event but a slow accretion of choices and circumstances. The theft of the laundry was the catalyst, the moment the system labeled him an outlaw, but the root cause lay in the graveyard in Silver City. Without the protective barrier of a family, the harsh elements of the West had full access to him. He was a boy molded by loss, sharpened by poverty, and now fueled by the adrenaline of escape. As he stood on the edge of the Arizona desert in late 1875, he was a blank slate upon which the violence of the territory was about to write its bloody history. The newspapers were not yet printing his name, and the lawmen of the territory did not yet know to fear him, but the mechanism of his making was already in motion. He was alone, he was hunted, and he was learning that in this hard country the only thing that guaranteed respect was the capacity for violence. The year 1876 found Henry McCarty drifting like a tumbleweed across the scorched, alkaline plains of the Arizona Territory, a landscape that possessed a feral hostility unlike anything he had known in the mining camps of New Mexico. This was a country defined by its emptiness, a vast silence-filled expanse where the sun beat down with a physical weight and the waterholes were guarded by rattlesnakes or Apaches. The boy, now 16 and stripped of any familial tether, found employment as a ranch hand on the massive Sierra Bonita Ranch, operated by the cattle baron Henry Hooker. The work was grueling, a daily test of endurance that required him to spend 12 hours in the saddle, driving cattle through scrub brush that tore at clothing and flesh alike. He was no longer the dishwasher or the hotel busboy. He was a laborer in the open air, his skin darkening to the color of saddle leather, his hands hardening into tools of the trade. The cowboys he rode with were rough men, drifting veterans of the Civil War or fugitives from Texas law. And from them, Henry absorbed the lexicon of the range. He learned to handle a rope with precision, to read the behavior of a herd, and most importantly, to handle a firearm with a speed that belied his slender frame. Despite his competence, Henry remained physically unimposing, a fact that drew the eyes of men who measured worth by muscle mass and brute strength. He was short, slight, and possessed a persistent cheerfulness that some interpreted as weakness. In the hypermasculine environment of the territory, his buck-toothed grin and lithe agility marked him as a boy among men, earning him the moniker Kid Antrim. He gravitated toward the area surrounding Fort Grant, a military outpost that served as a hub for the local economy of soldiers, contractors, and drifters. The fort was a collection of adobe buildings and canvas tents, situated at the base of the Pinaleño Mountains, a place where the rigid discipline of the U.S. Army collided with the chaotic licentiousness of the civilian camp followers. Here, the kid found a niche, working odd jobs, herding stock, and occasionally engaging in the theft of government horses alongside a Scottish veteran named John Mackey. The theft was a step up from stealing laundry. It was a hanging offense in some jurisdictions, but at Fort Grant it was merely part of the dangerous game played by men on the fringe. It was in the dusty, manure-scented environs of the post-sutler's store and the nearby saloons that the kid encountered Francis P. Cahill. Known to everyone as Windy due to his incessant boasting and loud mouth, Cahill was the post-blacksmith, a man of enormous physical proportions who seemed carved from the same iron he hammered daily on his anvil. Cahill was a bully in the purest sense, a man who derived pleasure from the domination of those smaller than himself. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle, developed by swinging a sledgehammer. To Cahill, the scrawny teenage kid was a natural target, a convenient object upon which he could demonstrate his dominance to the idle soldiers and drinkers who frequented the saloons. The blacksmith took an immediate sadistic dislike to the boy, perhaps offended by the kid's popularity or his refusal to be cowed by the older man's bluster. The torment began slowly, with verbal jabs and mocking insults delivered in the crowded confines of the cantina. Cahill would bellow across the room, calling attention to the kid's size, his clothes, or his lack of a beard. He referred to Henry as a pimp, a grave insult in the frontier lexicon, implying that the boy was subservient to other men or engaged in the lowest forms of vice. The soldiers would laugh, and the kid, adhering to a code of survival that dictated one did not start fights they could not win, would often laugh with them, deflecting the abuse with a self-deprecating joke or a shrug. But the laughter in his eyes did not reach his gut. Beneath the surface, a cold resentment was crystallizing. The kid was proud, and he was acutely aware of the power dynamics at play. Every time Cahill laid a heavy hand on his shoulder or slapped the back of his head, it chipped away at his dignity. Throughout the spring and summer of 1877, the abuse escalated from verbal taunts to physical humiliation. Cahill, emboldened by the kid's apparent passivity, grew rougher. He would corner the boy, using his bulk to pin him against a bar or a wall, slapping his face or knocking his hat into the dirt. The physical disparity was comical to the observers. Cahill could crush the kid with one hand. The blacksmith relished these displays, styling himself as a tough man who brooked no nonsense from runts. He did not realize that he was compressing a spring, pushing the boy into a corner where the only exit was violence. The kid continued to work, continued to steal horses with Mackey, and continued to frequent the saloons, but his demeanor around Cahill shifted. The smile became tighter, the blue eyes colder. He was carrying a revolver now, a ubiquitous tool in the territory, and he practiced with it until the draw was a fluid, unconscious motion. The breaking point arrived on August 17, 1877. The heat of the Arizona summer lay heavy on the land, the air stagnant and thick with dust. The kid entered George Adkins' saloon and dance hall, a popular watering hole near the fort where men gathered to gamble and drink away their pay. The atmosphere was smoky and loud, filled with the clatter of chips and the murmur of conversation. Cahill was there, holding court, his voice booming over the din. He spotted the kid and immediately launched into his routine, his face flushed with drink and aggression. He called the boy a pimp again, his voice carrying the insult to every corner of the room. The kid, tired, hot, and pushed beyond, his limit snapped back. He returned the insult, calling Cahill a son of a bitch, his voice steady and cutting through the noise. The room went quiet. Men turned from their cards, sensing the shift in the air. Cahill's face turned a mottled red. He was not used to the target biting back. He rose from his chair, a mountain of a man moving with surprising speed. He lunged at the kid, his intent clear. He was going to thrash the boy, to beat him into submission and re-establish the hierarchy. The kid tried to sidestep, but the room was crowded and Cahill's reach was long. The blacksmith's heavy arms wrapped around the boy and he threw him to the floor with the ease of a man tossing a sack of grain. The impact knocked the wind out of Henry, and before he could scramble away, Cahill was on top of him. The weight was crushing. Cahill pinned the kid's arms with his knees, his massive hands going for the boy's face, slapping and cuffing him. It was a chaotic, humiliating struggle. The kid thrashed, his boots scraping uselessly against the floorboards, but he was trapped under 200 pounds of angry muscle. Cahill was shouting, his spittle flying, enjoying the total domination of his victim. To the onlookers, it might have looked like a schoolyard beating gone wrong. But to Henry, it was a life-threatening assault. He felt the blacksmith's hands moving toward his throat, or perhaps just the sheer suffocating terror of being helpless beneath a giant. The instinct for self-preservation, honed in the alleys of New York and the jails of Silver City, took over. Henry's hand worked free, scrambling at his waist. He found the grip of his revolver, a double-action Thunderer or perhaps a single-action Army, the details blurring in the frenzy of the moment. He did not aim. He simply pressed the muzzle against the mass of flesh looming over him. He pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, a thunderclap that stopped the room cold. The bullet, a large-caliber slug, tore into Francis Cahill's abdomen, ripping through the intestines and lodging deep in his body. The blacksmith jerked violently, a look of shock replacing the rage on his face. The pressure on Henry's chest vanished as Cahill rolled to the side, clutching his gut, a low groan escaping his lips. The kid scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, the smoking gun still in his hand. The room was frozen in a tableau of violence. Cahill lay on the floor, the blood beginning to pool dark and thick on the wood. He was not dead, but he was dying. A gut shot was a slow, agonizing way to go, a guarantee of infection and prolonged suffering. The soldiers and civilians stared at the scrawny boy who had just felled the village giant. Henry looked down at the man who had tormented him for months. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the feral alertness of a trapped animal that had just bitten its way out of a snare. He did not flee immediately. He stood his ground as the reality of the act settled upon him. He had killed a man. This was not stealing laundry or rustling a horse. This was blood. The military police arrived quickly, attracted by the gunshot. They took the kid into custody, but the arrest was not aggressive. Even the soldiers knew Cahill was a bully, and many likely felt he had brought this upon himself. However, the law was the law. Henry was marched to the guardhouse. The the same structure that held deserters and drunks. He was shackled, the heavy iron cuffs biting into his wrists and placed under guard. The blacksmith lingered for a day, his large body fighting a losing battle against the internal damage. He died the following day, August 18, 1877, cursing the boy who shot him. The death of Francis Cahill changed the equation. The kid was now facing a potential murder charge, or at the very least, manslaughter. In a territory trying to establish order, a jury might not look kindly on a drifter killing a tradesman, regardless of the bullying. Henry sat in the guardhouse, the silence of the detention cell reminiscent of his time in Silver City. He knew what came next. A trial, a rope, a cage. He had escaped once, and he would do it again. The local authorities were lax, perhaps sympathetic, or perhaps just incompetent. The kid watched the rotation of the guards, looked for the weakness in the routine. He was not a criminal mastermind, but he was desperate, and he was fast. Opportunity presented itself swiftly. Whether through the negligence of a guard or the aid of a sympathetic party, the kid slipped his shackles. He did not crawl up a chimney this leading time. He simply seized the moment when attention was diverted. He stole a horse, perhaps the fastest one he could find, and vanished into the Arizona night. The escape was less about stealth and more about speed. He put the lights of Fort Grant behind him, riding hard into the darkness, the wind tearing at his clothes. He was leaving, behind the corpse of his first kill. And the identity of Kid Antrim, the bullied ranch hand. He rode east, back toward New Mexico, the land of his mother's death. The journey was a solitary one, a flight through the high desert where the stars hung low and bright. He was 17 years old, a fugitive with a price on his head, however small. The psychological threshold had been crossed. He had looked a man in the eye, or rather looked him in the gut, and pulled the trigger to save himself. The hesitation to use lethal force was gone. He had learned that in a world of giants like Cahill, the equalizer was the six-gun. The mocking laughter of the blacksmith would no longer haunt him, but the image of the man rolling on the floor, clutching his bleeding stomach, would be burned into his memory. He drifted back into the chaotic orbit of New Mexico, but he was different now. He was harder, more wary. He needed a new name to go with his new status. He began to introduce himself as William H. Bonney. The alias was an attempt to shed the skin of Henry McCarty and Kid Antrim, to create a distance between himself and the boy who had been slapped around in a saloon. William H. Bonney was not an orphan from the slums, he was a gunman from the territories. The transformation was internal as much as external. He carried himself with a new confidence, a quiet danger that warned men not to mistake his size for weakness. He arrived in the Mesilla Valley, engaging in the same drifting lifestyle but with a sharper edge. He joined up with the Jesse Evans gang, a group of hard-riding rustlers known as the Boys. This was a graduation from the petty thievery of John Mackey. The Boys were professionals, stealing cattle from the massive herds of John Chisholm and selling them to unscrupulous butchers and agents. The kid fit in. He was a superb rider, fearless in the saddle, and his skill with a gun was becoming undeniable. He rode with them through the dusty arroyos and the moonlight raids, absorbing the tactics of organized outlawry. He learned how to push a herd hard without running the tallow off them, how to spot a brand that had been altered, and how to fight as a unit. But even among the outlaws, he retained a certain independence. He was well-liked, his natural charisma drawing people to him. He was fluent in Spanish, a skill that endeared him to the local Hispanic population. He attended their bailes, danced with their daughters, and spoke their language with a respect that few Anglos bothered to show. This cultural fluidity would become one of his greatest assets, providing him with a network of friends and safe houses that the law could not penetrate. To the Mexicans, he was El Chivato, the little goat, or simply Billy. They saw the humanity in him that the newspapers would later ignore. However, the shadow of the Cahill killing followed him. He was a wanted man, a fugitive from Arizona justice. This status kept him moving, kept him from settling down. He could never fully relax, never fully trust that a hand on his shoulder wasn't a lawman coming to collect. The killing of Cahill had solved the immediate problem of the bully, but it had created a permanent problem of legal status. He was outside the law now, not just as a thief, but as a killer. The distinction was significant. It narrowed his options. Honest work was harder to find when you had to look over your shoulder constantly. The outlaw trail became the path of least resistance. By the time he drifted into Lincoln County in late 1877, the stage was being set for a conflict that would dwarf the saloon brawl in Camp Grant. The kid was walking into a war, but this time he would not be the victim. He was armed, he was experienced, and he had proven he could kill. The boy who had wept at his mother's grave was gone. In his place was Billy the Kid, a young man who had learned that the only thing that counted in the West was who drew first, and who shot straight. The counting of bodies had begun with a blacksmith in Arizona. It would not end there. The headlines were waiting to be written, and the soil of Lincoln County was waiting to be watered with blood. August 1877 brought William H. Bonney into the sprawling, violent theater of Lincoln County, New Mexico, a territory that functioned less like a jurisdiction of the United States and more like a medieval fiefdom ruled by iron and greed. The county itself was a staggering expanse of land, covering nearly 30,000 square miles of high plains, jagged mountains, and river valleys, a kingdom larger than many eastern states. At the center of this vast, dusty empire sat the town of Lincoln, a single street of adobe buildings arranged along the Bonito River, dominated entirely by a mercantile monopoly known simply as the House. The House was the operating arm of L.G. Murphy and his younger, more volatile partner, James Dolan. These men held the county in a stranglehold of debt and fear. They controlled the government contracts to supply the nearby Mescalero Apache Reservation and the Fort Stanton garrison, a lucrative racket that allowed them to price gouge the government while simultaneously bankrupting the local farmers and ranchers through predatory lending and inflated goods. Billy rode into this simmering cauldron of corruption not as a liberator but as a driftless gunman seeking a place to rest his head. He initially fell in with the very forces that terrorized the populace, joining the Jesse Evans gang, a loose confederation of rustlers and hard cases known locally as the Boys. Evans was a chaotic force, a man who served the interests of the House by harassing its enemies and stealing their stock. For a brief period in the autumn of 1877, Billy rode with them, his small boots resting in the stirrups next to men who killed for sport. They stole horses from the mescaleros and cattle from the encroaching Texas herds, living a life of dust-choked gallops and nights spent around fires fueled by dried cow dung. It was a brutal existence, but it offered the camaraderie the orphan craved. However, the kid possessed an innate intelligence that chafed against the mindless thuggery of Evans. He saw that the boys were merely pawns, disposable muscle for James Dolan, used to enforce a tyranny that kept the entire county poor. The pivot point in his life, and the history of the West, arrived in the form of John Henry Tunstall. Tunstall was a 24-year-old Englishman, the son of a wealthy merchant, who had arrived in New Mexico with pockets full of capital and a burning ambition to carve out his own empire. He was a man of refinement in a land of rough edges, dressing in tailored suits and speaking with a crisp, aristocratic diction that baffled the locals. Tunstall saw the monopoly of the House not as a formidable government-backed entity, but as a business opportunity to be smashed. He opened a rival store in Lincoln, the J.H. Tunstall & Co., directly challenging Murphy and Dolan, He undercut their prices, offered fair loans, and began buying land and cattle, intending to break their economic spine. To do this, he needed men who could ride and shoot, men who could protect his investment from the inevitable retaliation of the house. The meeting between the street urchin from New York and the merchant from London was an intersection of two worlds. Tunstall saw in Billy not just a gunman, but a young man of potential, loyal, sharp, and fearless. Billy in turn saw something he had never encountered, a man of status who treated him with dignity. Tunstall did not look down on the boy or mock his size. He offered him a job, a wage, and a place at his table. He gave the kid a purpose beyond mere survival. Billy defected from the Jesse Evans gang, turning his back on the rustlers to sign on with the Englishman. It was a decision that branded him a traitor in the eyes of Evans and a target in the eyes of James Dolan. The kid moved out to Tunstall's ranch on the Rio Feliz, a defensible spread surrounded by rolling hills and defensive ridgelines. Life at the Rio Feliz in the winter of 1877 was a tense waiting game. Tunstall assembled a crew of regulators to guard his herds, a mix of dedicated ranch hands and gunmen. Among them were Richard Dick Brewer, a stoic and respected yeoman farmer, terrorists of the range like Doc Skurlock and Charlie Boder, and the kid who quickly became a favorite of the Englishman. They spent their days patrolling the range, checking for house rustlers, and their evenings in the bunkhouse cleaning their weapons. Tunstall would often talk to Billy, lending him books and discussing the wider world. For the first time since his mother's death, Billy felt the warmth of a familial bond. He revered Tunstall, viewing him as the father figure he had been denied. He told the other hands that Tunstall was the only man who had ever treated him like he was free-born and white. But the powers in Lincoln were not idle. James Dolan, facing financial ruin from Tunstall's competition, decided to weaponize the law. He utilized the corrupt legal machinery of the territory, controlled by the Santa Fe Ring, a cabal of politicians and judges who profited from the graft. Dolan dredged up an old insurance policy dispute involving Tunstall's former partner Alexander McSween and used it to obtain a writ of attachment against Tunstall's property. It was a legal fiction, a piece of paper designed to give the color of law to an act of robbery. To execute this writ, Dolan turned to Sheriff William Brady. Brady was a weathered, compromised lawman who owed his position and his livelihood to the house. He was not an impartial arbiter of justice. He was Dolan's enforcer with a badge. In February 1878, the tension snapped. Sheriff Brady formed a posse to serve the writ and seize Tunstall's cattle. In a move of brazen illegality, Brady deputized the Jesse Evans gang. The very outlaws who had been stealing horses months prior were now sworn officers of the law, pinned with badges and handed warrants. It was a death squad masquerading as a civil process. The posse, numbering over 40 men, rode out from Lincoln, a heavy column of riders intent on violence. They were not coming to check brands. They were coming to destroy John Tunstall. On February 18th, 1878, the air was crisp and cold, the winter sun casting long, sharp shadows across the scrubland. Tunstall, aware of the approaching storm, decided to leave the Rio Feliz ranch. He intended to travel to Lincoln to intervene legally, but he also needed to move his prize horses to safety. He gathered a small group: Billy, Dick Brewer, Rob Weidenman, and John Middleton. They drove a herd of 9 horses ahead of them, moving through the rugged terrain of the canyon country. The mood was somber. They knew the law was hunting them. Tunstall, riding a magnificent bay horse, seemed strangely detached, perhaps underestimating the savagery of his opponents. He believed that his status as a British subject and a gentleman would shield him from physical harm. He did not understand that to men like Evans and Dolan he was simply an obstacle to be removed. The posse, led by Deputy William Matthews but driven by the malice of Jesse Evans, picked up their trail. A subgroup of about 15 men, the hardest of the hard cases, split off from the main body and spurred their mounts, closing the distance. Among them were Tom Hill, Frank Baker, and the outlaw Jesse Evans himself. They were heavily armed, drunk on whiskey and power, and eager for blood. They crested a ridge and saw the Tunstall party below. The terrain played a fatal role. As the posse closed in, some wild turkeys broke from the brush. In a moment of distraction that would haunt him forever, Billy and the other guards drifted away from Tunstall, giving chase to the birds or perhaps scouting the ridge, momentarily leaving the Englishman isolated. Tunstall was driving the horses, bringing up the rear, his pace slow. The separation was only a few hundred yards, but in the geography of an ambush, it was an ocean. The posse crested the hill behind Tunstall, their hooves thundering against the hard earth. Billy heard the gunfire erupt from the canyon floor. It was not the rhythmic pop of target practice, but the chaotic, rapid discharge of a skirmish. He spun his horse, his hand flying to his rifle, but he was too far away. Separated by a steep ravine and thick cover, he could only listen as the tragedy unfolded. Tunstall saw the riders thundering down upon him. He did not draw his weapon. He halted his horse, perhaps intending to parley, to use reason against the mob. The posse surrounded him, dust swirling around the horses. Jesse Evans, Tom Hill, and William Morton were the closest. There were no words of arrest, no reading of warrants. Morton raised his rifle and fired. The heavy caliber slug slammed into Tunstall's chest, punching through his coat and smashing into the cavity of his torso. The Englishman was knocked backward, reeling in the saddle, the breath driven from him in a spray of blood. He tumbled from his horse, hitting the ground hard. He was not dead yet, lying in the dirt, gasping for air, the sky spinning above him. The posse gathered around the fallen man. This was not law enforcement. It was an execution. One of the deputies, likely Tom Hill, dismounted and walked over to the groaning man. He placed the muzzle of his weapon against the back of Tunstall's head and pulled the trigger. The shot obliterated the Englishman's skull, extinguishing the life of the only man who had offered Billy a future. But the brutality did not end with the killing. The bloodlust of the posse required a final, grotesque punctuation. They shot Tunstall's prize horse, dropping the animal beside its master. Then, in a display of macabre humor, someone, perhaps Evans, dragged the bodies together. They arranged the dead horse and the dead man as if they were sleeping, placing Tunstall's hat under the horse's head and his coat over the animal. It was a mockery of the bond between man and beast, a crude joke left for the friends who would find the bodies. They laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the silence of the canyon, and then rode off, leaving the corpse to the buzzards and the coming night. Billy and the others, outnumbered and outgunned, had been forced to retreat to a defensive position on a hilltop when the shooting started. They watched the posse depart, the dust settling over the scene. When the coast was clear, they rode down into the canyon. The sight that greeted them was a horror. John Tunstall, the refined gentleman who had dreamed of a cattle empire, was a broken heap of bloody clothing. His face, once composed and intelligent, was destroyed. The ground was soaked with the dark, copper-smelling fluid of his life. The kid swung down from his saddle, his boots hitting the earth next to the body. He did not weep. The initial shock gave way to a cold, vibrating stillness. He looked at the shattered skull, at the cruel arrangement of the horse, and something inside him crystallized. The part of him that had hoped for a legitimate life, for a path away from the gun, died in that canyon alongside the Englishman. He realized then that there was no law in Lincoln County, only power. The sheriff was a murderer, the deputies were outlaws, and the judge was a ghost. The social contract had been torn up and used as wadding for a rifle cartridge lead. The others, Brewer, Weidenman, Middleton, were sickened and angry, talking of legal recourse, of filing charges, of contacting the federal authorities. Billy listened, but his mind was working on a different track. He knew that papers and judges would not answer for this. The men who did this, Morton, Baker, Hill, Evans, Brady, would never stand before a jury. The only justice available was the kind that came out of the barrel of a Winchester. They loaded the body onto a pack, animal, the limbs stiffening, and began the long, silent ride back to Lincoln. The journey was a funeral procession for the peace of the territory. As they rode, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a gray twilight. Billy rode in the rear, his eyes fixed on the back of the horse carrying the corpse. He was counting the names of the men he had seen on the ridge. He was calculating the debt that was owed. When they arrived in Lincoln, the town was quiet, the fear palpable in the air. The body was taken to the store, laid out on a table where Tunstall had once planned his business strategies. The local people, the Hispanics who had been crushed by the house and who had looked to Tunstall for relief, gathered around. They saw the brutality of the regime laid bare. But it was the reaction of the kid that terrified those who saw it. He stood over the body, his hand resting on the wood of the table. He swore a solemn oath not to God but to the dead man. He promised that he would kill every man who had a hand in the murder. He named them aloud, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Sheriff Brady, George Hindman, William Morton, Frank Baker. This was the beginning of the Lincoln County War. It was no longer a commercial dispute or a legal wrangle. It was a blood feud. The regulators, as Tunstall's men would soon call themselves, were born in that room, baptized in the blood of the Englishmen. They were deputized by the local justice of the peace, John Wilson, giving them a thin veneer of legality. But their mandate was personal. Billy was the tip of the spear. He was 18 years old, armed and fueled by a grief that had curdled into a singular homicidal purpose. The newspapers would soon begin to count the bodies, but they would not understand the boy who pulled the trigger. They would paint him as a demon, a natural-born killer. They would not see the orphan standing over the ruin of his second father, realizing that the world would never let him be anything but a weapon. The death of John Tunstall was the end of William H. Bonney, the aspiring ranch hand, and the birth of Billy the Kid, the avenging angel of the Rio Feliz. The war had officially begun, and the first casualty was mercy. As the sun rose on the morning after the murder, the landscape of Lincoln seemed to have changed. The shadows were deeper, the silence heavier. The kid checked his weapons, cleaning the dust of the canyon from the mechanisms. He loaded the chambers of his revolver one by one, the metallic clicks sounding like the ticking of a doomsday clock. He was done running. He was done hiding. He was going hunting. The hunters who had laughed over Tunstall's body had made a fatal error. They had left the wolf alive, and the wolf was hungry. March 1878 dawned over Lincoln County with a sky the color of bruised iron. The weather matching the sullen, murderous mood that had settled over the territory following the execution of John Tunstall. The funeral was over. The body of the Englishman was in the ground, but the soil was still loose and fresh, a physical wound in the earth that demanded a reckoning. The legal machinery, usually a rusted and sluggish apparatus in the territories, suddenly ground into motion, fueled by the righteous fury of Alexander McSween and the cold, tactical anger of the Kid. Justice of the peace. John Wilson, a man who saw the corruption of the Murphy-Dolan faction for what it was, issued warrants for the arrest of Tunstall's killers. The names on the papers were the men who had laughed over the corpse, William Morton, Frank Baker, and the others who had ridden with the posse. To serve these warrants, Wilson appointed a constable, Atanasio Martinez, who in turn deputized a group of men who would soon carve their name into the bloody history of the West. They called themselves the Regulators. The group was a collection of hard men, farmers, and gunmen united by a singular purpose that blurred the line between law enforcement and vengeance. Richard Dick Brewer, the foreman of Tunstall's ranch, was the leader, a man of stoic determination. With him rode Frank McNabb, a cattle detective with a hair-trigger temper. Charlie Boder, a Mississippi native who owned a hat shop but preferred the weight of a pistol. Doc Scurlock, a man whose intellectual demeanor hid a capacity for extreme violence. And the kid, William H. Bonney. Billy was the youngest, the smallest, and arguably the most dangerous, for his grief had calcified into a predatory focus. He was 18 years old, riding under the color of law, holding a warrant that gave him permission to hunt the men who had taken his friend. The Regulators were ironclad, fully legal deputies of the territory, a fact they clung to as they checked their Winchesters and cinched their saddle girths. Their first target was the sub-posse that had pulled the triggers. Intelligence reached them that William Morton and Frank Baker were hiding out near the Penasco River, deep in the rugged country to the south. On March 6, 1878, the Regulators rode out of Lincoln, a column of armed men moving through the scrub brush with the grim efficiency of a wolf pack. They tracked their quarry for 3 days, covering miles of broken terrain where the wind whipped the dust into blinding clouds. The pursuit ended on March 9th, when they cornered Morton and Baker near the junction of the Penasco. The fugitives, realizing they were outgunned and cut off, surrendered after a tense standoff. They likely believed that their connection to the powerful House of Murphy would protect them, or that they would be taken back to Lincoln for a trial where a friendly judge would exonerate them. They handed over their weapons, a fatal miscalculation of the Regulators' intent. The ride back toward Lincoln was a slow journey through a landscape that offered no comfort. The prisoners, Morton and Baker, rode in the center of the column, their hands bound, their eyes scanning the faces of their captors for any sign of mercy. They found none. The Regulators were not interested in the slow turn of the judicial wheel. Among the group was a man named William McCloskey, a former employee of Murphy who had joined the Regulators but whose loyalty was suspect. McCloskey had been vocal in his defense of the prisoners, arguing that they should be delivered safely to the jail in Lincoln. His insistence on protocol grated on men like McNabb and the kid, who viewed the prisoners not as suspects, but as condemned men walking. On the afternoon of March 9th, the party reached a remote location known as Blackwater Creek. The terrain was desolate, a place of scrub oak and dry arroyos where a scream would travel for miles without reaching a sympathetic ear. The column halted. The air was thick with a tension that made the horses nervous. McCloskey was riding alongside the prisoners, still arguing for their safety. The precise choreography of what happened next remains buried in the dust of that creek bed, but the violence was sudden and absolute. Frank McNabb, his patience eroded, raised his pistol. He accused McCloskey of being a spy, a traitor who would sell them out to Dolan the moment they reached town. Before McCloskey could offer a defense, a shot rang out. A heavy slug tore through his head, dropping him from his saddle instantly. He hit the ground dead, his blood soaking into the thirsty earth. The traitor was gone. With the buffer removed, Morton and Baker knew their time had run out. They spurred their horses in a desperate, futile attempt to escape, or perhaps they were told to run to provide a pretext for the shooting. It made no difference. The Regulators raised their rifles, the levers cycling with a mechanical clatter. A volley of gunfire erupted, echoing off the canyon walls. Morton and Baker were riddled with bullets. They fell from their mounts, their bodies tumbling into the dirt and rocks. The Regulators rode up to the fallen men to ensure the work was finished. There was no medical aid rendered, no prayers said. This was an execution, stark and brutal. The bodies were left where they fell, food for the coyotes and the buzzards. The Regulators turned their horses north, leaving 3 corpses in the weeds of Blackwater Creek. When they filed their report, they claimed the prisoners had snatched McCloskey's gun, killed him, and were shot while fleeing. It was a lie that fooled no one, least of all the faction in Lincoln. The killings at Blackwater Creek stripped away the veneer of legal process. When the news reached Santa Fe, the political machine controlled by the Santa Fe ring moved swiftly to protect its assets. Governor Samuel Axtell, a puppet of the ring, issued a proclamation on March 18, 1878. He stripped Justice Wilson of his authority and annulled the appointments of the regulators. In the stroke of a pen, the status of the Kid and his companions flipped. They were no longer deputies enforcing the law. They were now outlaws, murderers with a price on their heads. Sheriff William Brady, the man who had organized the posse that killed Tunstall, was reinstated as the sole legal authority in the county. The regulators were now the hunted. The injustice of the proclamation burned in Billy's gut like a coal. He saw clearly that the law was a weapon used by the powerful to crush the weak. Brady was not a sheriff. He was a hitman with a badge. The Kid returned to Lincoln, slipping into the town that was now a hostile camp. The regulators made their headquarters in the McSween home and the Tunstall store, turning the adobe structures into a fortress. They cut loopholes in the thick mud walls, creating firing ports that overlooked the main street. They waited, watching the dusty thoroughfare, their fingers resting near the triggers of their Winchesters. The town of Lincoln held its breath, the silence heavy and ominous. April 1st, 1878 arrived with a bright, deceptive calm. It was a Monday, the day court was scheduled to convene. The town was bustling with activity as citizens gathered for the legal proceedings. The regulators were holed up behind the adobe wall of the corral behind the Tunstall store. The position offered a commanding view of the street, a kill zone that anyone walking from the Dolan store to the courthouse had to traverse. Inside the corral were Billy Jim French, Frank McNabb, John Middleton, Fred Waite, and Henry Brown. They were a hit squad waiting for the target to present himself. Around 9 in the morning, Sheriff William Brady exited the Murphy Dolan store. He was accompanied by deputies, George Heineman, Billy Matthews, and George Pepin. Brady was a man confident in his power, walking down the center of the wide dirt street, his badge glinting in the morning sun. He was armed, carrying a rifle and wearing a revolver. But he did not seem to expect an ambush in broad daylight on the main street of the county seat. He walked with the heavy gait of a man who owned the town. Hinman walked a few paces behind him. They were heading east, toward the courthouse, a path that would take them directly past the adobe wall where the Kid and his companions lay in wait. The regulators watched them come. The distance closed. 200 yards, 100 yards, 50. The men behind the wall adjusted their sights, the stocks of their rifles pressed against their cheeks. The Kid's eyes were fixed on Brady. This was the man who had sent the killers to the Rio Feliz. This was the face of the corruption that had murdered Tunstall. There was no hesitation, no moral debate. When the lawmen were directly opposite the corral gate, the signal was given. A deafening roar shattered the morning quiet as the regulators unleashed a volley of fire. The air filled with white smoke and the supersonic crack of high-velocity projectiles. Sheriff Brady was hit by multiple rounds simultaneously. The heavy slugs hammered into his body, tearing through muscle and bone. He did not stumble. He was smashed to the ground, his body collapsing into the dust as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He likely died before he hit the earth, his body riddled with at least a dozen wounds. Deputy George Heineman was also struck. A bullet tore through his torso, a mortal wound that dropped him to the roadway. He cried out, a terrible gurgling sound begging for water. Billy Matthews and George Pepin, reacting with the instinct of survivors, dove for cover. They scrambled behind a nearby adobe house, bullets kicking up spurts of dirt around their boots. The street, moments before a scene, of civic order was now a slaughterhouse. The firing stopped as quickly as it had begun. The smoke drifted slowly in the still air. Brady lay motionless in the dirt. Heinemann was writhing in agony. It was a successful ambush, a military-style execution of the enemy command. But then, the kid made a mistake, an error born of adrenaline or perhaps a desire to reclaim a trophy. He vaulted over the adobe wall and ran out into the open street. He sprinted toward the body of Sheriff Brady. Some said he wanted to retrieve the warrant for his own arrest that Brady carried in his pocket. Others believed he wanted the Winchester rifle that lay beside the dead lawman, a weapon that had once belonged to Tunstall. As Billy stooped over the corpse, reaching for the rifle, the surviving deputy, Billy Matthews, poked his rifle around the corner of the house where he had taken shelter. Matthews took aim at the slender figure in the street. He fired. The bullet missed the kid's vital organs but tore through the flesh of his thigh, a searing line of fire that knocked him off balance. The impact spun Billy around. He grabbed the rifle, abandoned the warrant, and scrambled back toward the safety of the corral, limping heavily, blood beginning to stain his trousers. The pain was sharp and immediate, a reminder that he was not a ghost, but flesh and blood. Inside the corral, the regulators were reloading, their faces grim. They had done it. They had killed the sheriff. The enormity of the act began to settle on them. This was not a skirmish in the brush. This was the assassination of the highest law enforcement officer in the county, committed in broad daylight in the center of town. They were no longer just a faction in a range war. They were cop killers. The entire weight of the territorial and federal government would now descend upon them. Dr. Taylor Ely, a physician and missionary who had recently arrived in Lincoln, rushed out into the street to attend to the fallen men. He found Brady beyond help, his body a ruin of bullet holes. Hinman was still alive, gasping for air, his life leaking out into the New Mexico dirt. Ely called for water, trying to comfort the dying man. But Heinemann expired within minutes, joining his superior officer in death. The street was slick with blood, the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy between the adobe buildings. The regulators did not linger to gauge the public reaction. With Billy wounded and the town rousing itself from the shock, they mounted their horses. They exited the rear of the corral, spurring their mounts toward the Rio Hondo. The pain in Billy's leg was a throbbing agony, pulsing with every stride of the horse, but he clamped his teeth and rode. He could not be caught now. There would be no trial for the killer of Sheriff Brady. There would only be a rope thrown over the nearest cottonwood limb. The assassination on April 1st marked the end of any pretense of civilization in Lincoln County. The counting of bodies had moved from the remote canyons to the county seat. The newspapers would scream about the atrocity, painting the kid as a demon who gunned down lawmen from ambush. They would ignore the legal wrangling, the voided warrants, and the murder of Tunstall that had birthed this violence. To the press and the politicians in Santa Fe, Billy was now a rabid dog that needed to be put down. But to the people of the county, the poor farmers and the Hispanics who lived under the heel of the house, the shooting was something else. It was a terrifying signal that the power of Murphy and Dolan was not absolute. The sheriff was dead. The invincible enforcer of the monopoly was lying in the dirt, killed by the boy who used to wash dishes at the hotel. The war had escalated to a total conflict, a zero-sum game where the only currency was death. As the regulators rode into the hills seeking a place to tend to Billy's wound and plan their next move, the landscape seemed to close in around them. They were isolated, cut off from the law, cut off from society. They were a brotherhood of the damned, bound together by the blood on their hands. Billy looked back at the town of Lincoln, shrinking in the distance. He had kept his promise to Tunstall. Brady was dead. Heinemann was dead. Morton and Baker were dead. The list was getting shorter, but the graves were getting more numerous. The doom of the sheriff was complete, but the doom of the kid was just beginning. The road ahead was painted in red and there was no turning back. April 4th, 1878, brought the regulators to the edge of the Tularosa Valley, a rugged depression in the landscape dominated by the imposing presence of the Sierra Blanca. The group rode into the settlement known as Blazer's Mills, a collection of structures built around a sawmill and the local Indian agency, seeking food and a brief respite from the relentless tension of being hunted men. The assassination of Sheriff Brady 3 days prior had severed their last tie to legality in the eyes of the Santa Fe Ring, and they were now operating as a roving paramilitary unit, governed only by the orders of Richard Brewer and the shared instinct for survival. The air at the mill was filled with the resinous scent of cut pine and the sound of the rushing water that powered the great saw blade, a rhythmic mechanical noise that usually signified industry and peace. The regulators dismounted, their bodies stiff from days in the saddle. Billy Bonney slid from his horse with a wince, the flesh wound in his thigh from the ambush in Lincoln still throbbing with a dull, hot pain, a constant reminder of the bullet fired by Billy Matthews. He limped slightly, favoring the leg, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the perimeter of the agency buildings. The group, numbering nearly 15 men, included the core of the ironclad squad: Dick Brewer, Charlie Bowder, Doc Skurlock, Frank McNabb, John Middleton, the Coe cousins, George and Frank, and the Kid. They were heavily armed, bristling with Winchesters and revolvers, a visual warning to anyone who might consider challenging their presence. They secured a meal from the bewildered staff at the agency, settling into a tense relaxation. The sun was high and bright, casting sharp shadows across the dusty ground of the compound. It was a moment of calm, a rare pause in the cycle of violence where they could loosen their belts and eat a hot meal without looking down the barrel of a gun. They did not know that the war was riding toward them on a mule. Around 11 in the morning, a solitary figure approached the mill from the direction of Las Tablas. He was riding a mule, a stubborn and unglamorous mount that suited the rider perfectly. The man was Andrew L. Buckshot Roberts, a relic of a harder time, a former buffalo hunter and soldier who carried the scars of a lifetime of combat. Roberts was a small man, physically diminished by age and injury, his right arm crippled and useless from an old wound forcing him to shoot his carbine from the hip. But what he lacked in physical perfection, he made up for in sheer, stubborn lethality. He was employed by the House, or at least sympathetic to their cause, and had been named on the same arrest warrants that the regulators carried, though the legality of those papers was now void. Roberts had come to the mill not to fight, but to check for a letter and perhaps collect a check from the sale of his ranch, intending to leave the territory and the war behind him. He rode into the compound, unaware that the very men who wanted him dead were eating lunch a few yards away. As he dismounted near the agency office, he was spotted. The reaction among the regulators was immediate. Several men recognized the old hunter instantly. Frank Coe, who had known Roberts in calmer times and shared a degree of mutual respect with him, walked out to the porch to parley. The other regulators hung back, weapons ready, watching the conversation from the corners of the buildings. The air grew heavy, the sound of the river fading into the background noise of adrenaline. Coe sat with Roberts on the steps of the agency, the two men engaging in a quiet, deadly serious conversation. Coe urged the old man to surrender, promising him that he would be treated fairly if he gave up his weapons. He pleaded with Roberts, telling him that the regulators were too many, that a fight would only end one way. Roberts, resting his shotgun across his lap, shook his head. He knew the nature of the men hiding around the corner. He knew that surrender meant a short ride to a quiet spot and a bullet in the back of the head. He told Coe that he had never given up his gun to any man and did not intend to start now. He preferred to die fighting rather than be executed in a ditch. The conversation dragged on for nearly half an hour, a surreal negotiation between life and death while the sun beat down on the adobe walls. Inside the house and around the corners, the patience of the regulators evaporated. They were tired of the talk. They were the law, or so they told themselves, and they had a warrant to execute. Richard Brewer, the commander, signaled that the time for words was over. He ordered his men to take Roberts into custody by force if necessary. A group of them, including Charlie Boder, George Coe, and the kid, moved around the corner of the building, weapons raised. The visual of the regulators swarming the porch shattered the stalemate. Charlie Boder, aggressive and tightly wound, leveled his shotgun at the seated man. He shouted a command, demanding Roberts throw up his hands. The old buffalo hunter did not hesitate. In a motion that defied his crippled limb, Roberts brought his own weapon up. The two men fired almost simultaneously, the twin blasts merging into a single deafening roar that shook the window panes of the agency. Boder's shot was true but slightly low. The buckshot tore into Roberts' midsection, a devastating gut wound that would have dropped a lesser man instantly. But Roberts, fueled by the shock and a lifetime of survival instinct, kept his feet. His own shot, fired from the hip, went wide of Boder but struck George Coe. The heavy projectile smashed into Coe's right hand, severing his trigger finger and thumb in a spray of blood and bone, destroying his ability to ever shoot a pistol effectively again. The porch erupted into chaos. Roberts, bleeding heavily from the stomach, stumbled backward, pumping the lever of his carbine with a speed that blurred the eye. He was a cornered badger, fighting with a ferocity that stunned the younger men. He retreated into the doorway of Dr. Blazer's office, using the thick adobe doorframe as a shield. The regulators opened fire, their bullets chipping the plaster and wood around him, filling the air with dust and smoke. Billy, seeing the old man wounded and retreating, made a rash decision. Perhaps he thought Roberts was done, or perhaps the adrenaline of the moment overrode his tactical sense. He sprinted from cover, rushing the door to finish the fight. It was a mistake. Roberts saw the movement and swung his weapon toward the blur of the boy. He fired. The bullet missed Billy's vital organs but grazed his arm, the hot metal carving a furrow through his flesh. The impact spun Billy around and he scrambled back to safety, realizing that the cripple was far from dead. The old man was a fortress of pain and gunpowder, holding the entire squad at bay. Inside the office, Roberts dragged himself to a mattress on the floor. He was dying. The wound in his gut was catastrophic, his intestines perforated. But he was not dead yet. He found a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle, a weapon capable of killing a bison at 1,000 yards, and a supply of ammunition. He lay on the mattress facing the open door, a dying sniper waiting for a target. The regulators poured fire into the room, riddling the walls and furniture, but they could not see the man lying low on the floor. John Middleton, a tall and imposing figure among the regulators, peered around the corner of the building, trying to get a clear shot into the dark interior. Roberts, watching the slice of light from the doorway, saw the shadow move. He fired the heavy rifle. The large-caliber slug caught Middleton in the chest, the impact lifting the large man off his feet and slamming him into the dirt. The wound was grievous, the bullet passing through his lung. Middleton gasped for air, blood frothing at his lips as his companions dragged him out of the line of fire. The regulators were reeling. In the span of 3 minutes, George Coe was mutilated, Billy was wounded, and John Middleton was shot through the chest. One dying man with a crippled arm had effectively neutralized 3 of their best gunmen. The psychological toll was immense. They had expected a quick execution, a simple arrest of an old man. Instead, they had walked into a buzzsaw. Richard Brewer, the leader who had held the group together through the chaos of the past month, was furious. He could not allow a single man to root his entire command. He circled around the back of the agency buildings, moving toward the sawmill and the piles of driftwood and logs that lined the riverbank. He intended to flank Roberts, to get an angle into the room that the doorway did not offer. Brewer crept through the lumber yard, his boots silent on the sawdust. He found a position behind a large log, about 100 yards from the open door of the room where Roberts lay. Brewer raised his head slowly, peering over the bark of the log. He saw the open door. He did not know that Roberts, lying in agony on the mattress, was watching that very spot. The old hunter's eyes, trained to spot the twitch of a buffalo's ear at extreme distances, caught the silhouette of the hat rising above the wood. Roberts raised the heavy Sharps rifle one last time. He did not have the strength to hold it steady, so he rested the barrel on the mattress or a windowsill, aligning the sights with the distant speck of Brewer's head. The shot cracked across the valley, a singular, thunderous report that signaled the end of the engagement. The heavy slug flew true, covering the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck Richard Brewer squarely in the left eye, passing through his brain and exiting the back of his skull. The leader of the regulators died instantly, his body slumping behind the log, his finger slipping from the trigger of his unfired weapon. There was no cry, no struggle. The man who had sworn to avenge Tunstall was gone, erased by a bullet from a dying man. The silence that followed was absolute. The regulators waited for Brewer to fire, to give a command to move. But there was only the sound of the river and the wind. Slowly, the realization spread through the group. They called out to him, but there was no answer. When they finally reached his position and saw the devastation of the wound, the fight went out of them completely. They were leaderless, battered, and humiliated. They had lost their commander, and their best shooters were bleeding. Dr. Blazer, the owner of the mill, emerged from the main house waving a white cloth. He shouted to the regulators that Roberts was done, that he had no more fight left in him, and begged them to leave before more blood was spilled. The regulators, demoralized and in shock, agreed. They gathered their wounded. George, Coe, was pale and shaking, clutching his ruined hand. Middleton was strapped onto a horse, his breathing shallow and wet. Billy nursed his arm, his face grim. They mounted up and rode out of Blazer's Mills, leaving behind the body of Dick Brewer and the dying Buckshot Roberts. The retreat was a somber affair. They had arrived as the hunters, the dominant force in the county, confident in their numbers and their cause. They left as a broken remnant, defeated by a single man who refused to be bullied. The ride back to San Patricio was a journey of pain and reflection. The death of Brewer created a vacuum in the leadership of the regulators. He had been the stabilizing force, the man with the moral authority and the legal standing. Without him, the group was more volatile, more prone to the wild impulses of men like the Kid. Back at the mill, Andrew Roberts lingered in agony. The gut shot was a cruel sentence. He lay in the doctor's room, the pain coming in waves that tore at his consciousness. He spoke briefly with the people at the mill, maintaining his defiance to the end. He had taken one with him, he said. He had made them pay for coming after him. He died the following day, April 5, 1878, his body finally succumbing to the trauma. He was buried on a hill overlooking the mill near the fresh grave of Richard Brewer. The two men who had killed each other lay side by side in the rocky soil of the Tularosa, united in death as they never could be in life. The Battle of Blazer's Mills was a tactical disaster for the regulators and a turning point in the Lincoln County War. It stripped away the last vestiges of their legal legitimacy in the eyes of the public. They had attacked a lone man and been repulsed with heavy casualties. The newspapers would not count this as a victory for the lawmen. It was a messy, bloody brawl that proved only that the violence in Lincoln County had spiraled beyond the control of any single man or faction. For Billy, the skirmish was a lesson in the unpredictability of violence. He had seen the sure thing turn into a disaster. He had felt the wind of a bullet that should have killed him. He had watched his friends fall and his leader die. The invincibility of youth was being chipped away, replaced by the scar tissue of survival. The war was not a game of chess, it was a knife fight in a dark room, and the cost of admission was your soul. As the sun set on April 4th, the regulators camped miles away, the mood dark and foreboding. They tended to Middleton's chest and Coe's hand, boiling water and tearing shirts for bandages. Billy sat apart, cleaning his rifle, his eyes staring into the fire. The count was rising. Tunstall, Brady, Hindman, Morton, Baker, McCloskey, Brewer, Roberts. The valley was filling up with ghosts, and the kid knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the killing was far from over. The death of Brewer meant that the restraint was gone. The next phase of the war would be fought without rules, without mercy, and without end. July 15, 1878, marked the beginning of the end for the Regulator faction. Not with a sudden ambush in a canyon, but with a slow, painful constriction in the very heart of Lincoln. The town, a dusty ribbon of adobe along the Bonito River, had transformed into a militarized zone. The Regulators, numbering roughly 60 men, had ridden back into the county seat with a desperate resolve to settle the war on their terms. They fortified themselves in 3 main strongholds: the Ellis store on the east end of town, the Montana House, and most critically, the sprawling adobe home of Alexander McSween. The McSween residence was a fortress of thick mud bricks, U-shaped and defensible, serving as the nerve center for the resistance. Inside, Billy Bonney, now fully healed from the flesh wound he received in April, prepared for a siege alongside the core of the fighting force. Jim French, Harvey Morris, Tom O'Folliard, Jose Chavez y Chavez, and the lawyer Alexander, McSween himself. McSween was not a gunman. He was a man of statutes and scripture, clutching a Bible rather than a Winchester, yet his home was the epicenter of the violence he had helped unleash. Opposing them was Sheriff George Pepin, the successor to the slain William Brady. Pepin was a creature of the Murphy-Dolan faction, and he had assembled a posse that resembled a small army. He deputized nearly everyone who could pull a trigger and held a grudge against the Tunstall faction, swelling his ranks with the Seven Rivers Warriors, the Jesse Evans gang, and toughs from the John Kinney gang. By mid-July, the town was surrounded by Pepin's forces, who took up positions in the Torian, a stone defensive tower, the Murphy-Dolan store, and the Wortley Hotel. Snipers positioned themselves on the high ground overlooking the McSween house, and in the adobe ruins scattered around the perimeter. The trap was set. The dusty street that divided the two factions became a no-man's land, swept by the invisible lines of sight from 100 rifle barrels. The shooting began sporadically on the 15th, a chaotic exchange of fire that cracked and echoed off the canyon walls. Bullets thudded into the adobe walls, gouging out chunks of dried mud and sending clouds of dust into the rooms where the defenders waited. For the first 3 days, the conflict was a stalemate of noise and nerves. The Regulators held their ground, returning fire from behind barricaded windows and loopholes cut into the walls. They controlled the buildings, but they did not control the street. They were pinned. The summer heat of July bore down on the valley, baking the town and turning the interiors of the fortified houses into ovens. Water became a precious commodity, rationed carefully among the men who crouched in the shadows, their faces streaked with sweat and gunpowder soot. The stalemate broke on July 19, 1878, with the arrival of the United States Army. Colonel Nathan Dudley, the commander of nearby Fort Stanton, marched a column of troops into Lincoln. Dudley claimed he was there to protect non-combatants, but his sympathies clearly lay with the Murphy-Dolan faction. He brought with him a force that rendered the rifles of the Regulators irrelevant: cavalry troopers, infantrymen, a Gatling gun, and a 12-pounder mountain howitzer. The soldiers set up camp in the street, effectively bisecting the battlefield. The presence of the blue-coated troops emboldened Pepin's posse and demoralized the Regulators. The soldiers trained the howitzer on the Montagno store and the Ellis house, forcing the regulators in those positions to flee. The defenders in the McSween house were now completely isolated, cut off from their allies and staring down the barrel of federal intervention. Colonel Dudley declared that he would not fire on the combatants unless fired upon, but he allowed Pepin's men to move freely past his lines while the soldiers acted as a shield against regulator fire. This tactical advantage allowed the attackers to close the noose. Around 2 in the afternoon on the 19th, a group of Pepin's men managed to creep up to the blind side of the McSween house. They piled kindling and wood against the north wing of the building, dousing it with coal oil. A match was struck, and the dry timber caught instantly. The flames licked up the side of the adobe, finding purchase in the wooden window frames and the vigas that supported the roof. The fire started slowly, a creeping menace that added a new, terrifying element to the siege. The smoke began to curl into the rooms, acrid and blinding. The defenders tried to fight the flames with the little water they had, but it was a losing battle. The fire was not a sudden explosion, but a relentless eating thing. It moved from room to room, consuming the floors and the roof beams. The heat inside the house rose to intolerable levels. The regulators were forced to retreat, room by room, backing away from the advancing wall of fire. They crowded into the remaining unburnt sections, coughing in the thick smoke, their eyes watering. Outside, the posse waited, their rifles trained on the doors and windows, waiting for the heat to flush the game from the den. As the sun began to set, the situation inside the McSween house became apocalyptic. The roof of the north wing collapsed with a roar, sending a shower of sparks into the darkening sky. The fire illuminated the town with a hellish orange glow. Mrs. Susan McSween, Alexander's wife, who had remained in the house throughout the ordeal, finally negotiated safe passage out. She emerged from the burning building, a figure of defiance amidst the ruin, and confronted Colonel Dudley, demanding he stop the arson. Dudley refused to intervene, washing his hands of the slaughter. Her departure removed the last moral constraint on the attackers. With the woman gone, the posse prepared for the final kill. By 9 o'clock that night, the house was mostly consumed. The regulators were crowded into the kitchen, the last room still standing. The heat was blistering, singing the hair on their arms. The smoke was so thick they had to crouch near the floor to breathe. They had 2 choices, stay and burn or run and die. Billy, whose survival instinct operated at a frequency higher than any other man in the room, took command of the breakout. The plan was simple and desperate. They would burst out of the back door, running for the darkness of the riverbank and the trees beyond. Some would provide covering fire while the others sprinted for the gap in the adobe wall that led to freedom. The signal was given. The back door was thrown open. The regulators surged out into the night, coughing and yelling. But the posse was waiting. As soon as the silhouettes appeared against the backdrop of the flames, the darkness erupted with muzzle flashes. A wall of projectile death slammed into the escaping men. It was a chaotic, swirling melee of gunfire, smoke, and screams. The yard behind the house became a slaughter pen. Alexander McSween, the man whose legal battle had started it all, stumbled out into the yard. He was unarmed, still clutching his Bible, perhaps believing that his status as a non-combatant would save him. Or perhaps he was simply too paralyzed by fear to raise a weapon. He shouted that he surrendered. A deputy, Robert Beckwith, stepped forward from the shadows. There was no arrest. Beckwith raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck McSween in the chest. As McSween fell, another volley tore into him. He died in his own backyard, his blood mingling with the dust and the ash of his burning home. In a spasm of return fire from the regulators, Beckwith was also hit, a bullet striking him in the eye and killing him instantly, his body falling near the man he had just executed. Harvey Morris, a law student who had come to Lincoln to read for the bar and found himself in a war, ran alongside Billy. He was young, inexperienced, and terrified. As they sprinted toward the wall, the posse opened up with everything they had. Morris was struck in the chest and collapsed, dead before he hit the ground. Billy did not stop. He hurdled the body of his friend, his boots kicking up sparks. He was a phantom in the smoke, moving with a frantic speed that made him a difficult target. Bullets zipped past him, tearing through his clothes, snapping the air around his ears. He fired his revolvers blindly into the darkness as he ran, creating a suppression zone more psychological than physical. Tomo Folliard and Jose Chavez were running with him. They reached the adobe wall at the edge of the property. It was a high barrier, but panic gave them wings. They scrambled over the top, dropping into the brush on the other side just as the wood of the gate shattered under a hail of gunfire. They tumbled down the slope toward the Bonito River, crashing through the willows and the reeds. The water was cool and dark, a stark contrast to the inferno they had just escaped. They splashed across the river, slipping on the smooth stones, and scrambled up the far bank, vanishing into the trees. Back in the yard, the shooting tapered off. The McSween house was a roaring bonfire, the flames reaching high into the night, casting long, dancing shadows over the bodies of the dead. Alexander McSween lay still, his war over. Harvey Morris lay nearby. Several other men were dead or wounded in the perimeter. The posse moved in cautiously, kicking the bodies to ensure they were dead, looting weapons and valuables. They cheered, drinking whiskey and celebrating the destruction of the regulator leadership. The house burned until it was nothing but a shell of blackened adobe walls, a monument to the violence of the factional hate. The escape of the kid was a bitter pill for the Murphy-Dolan faction. They had burned the house, killed the financier, and scattered the army, but the most dangerous gunman had slipped through their fingers like smoke. Billy O'Folliard and the other survivors regrouped in the hills outside of town. They were blackened with soot, their clothes singed, their lungs raw from smoke inhalation. They looked back at the glow of the fire in the distance. The war, in the sense of pitched battles and legal maneuvers, was effectively over. The regulators as an organization were crushed. McSween was dead. Tunstall was dead. Brewer was dead. The money was gone. The legal authority was gone. But for Billy, the war had simply changed shape. It was no longer a fight for control of the county, it was a fight for existence. He was now a fugitive with no backing, no home, and no future other than the one he could carve out with a gun. The burning of the McSween house severed the last tie he had to a legitimate life. He was now fully and irrevocably an outlaw. The flames that consumed the house also consumed the last of Henry McCarty. Only the kid remained. The aftermath of the 5-day siege left Lincoln a traumatized, broken community. The smell of burnt wood and death hung over the town for days. The bodies were buried, but the animosity remained. Colonel Dudley's intervention was investigated, but the political machine protected him. The governor eventually declared a general amnesty for combatants on both sides. But this applied only to crimes committed during the war and excluded those currently under indictment for murder. Billy, having been indicted for the killing of Sheriff Brady, was not covered. He remained a wanted man, a wolf's head with a price on it. July 20th, 1878 dawned on a quiet, smoking ruin. The power of the house was absolute, but it was a hollow victory. The county was bankrupt, the herds were scattered, and the population was terrorized. The counting of bodies in the headlines reached a fever pitch. The Eastern press began to pick up the story, spinning tales of a boy bandit who fought an army and walked out of a burning house. The legend was growing, feeding on the ashes of Lincoln. Billy rode east toward the open plains of the Llano Estacado, toward the gambling tables of Fort Sumner. He left the mountains behind. The siege had taught him that walls were a trap. He would never again let himself be pinned down. From now on, his home would be the saddle, and his safety would rely on movement. The gritty reality of the burning house, the screams of the dying and the heat of the flames were etched into his mind. He had looked into the face of the apocalypse and spat in its eye. The boy was gone. The survivor rode on. August 1878 found the high plains of New Mexico baking under a relentless sun, the heat waves shimmering off the hardpan of the Llano Estacado. William H. Bonney was no longer a soldier in a factional war. He was a survivor drifting through the wreckage of his own life. The burning of the McSween house had severed the final tether binding him to the concept of legitimate employment. The regulators were scattered to the wind, hiding in the mountains or fleeing to other territories, but Billy remained in the mesmerizing, dangerous orbit of Lincoln County. He moved east, toward the Pecos River Valley and the settlement of Fort Sumner, a place that would become his sanctuary and his stage. Fort Sumner was a ghost of a military post, the adobe barracks now occupied by a squatter population of poor Hispanics, drifters, and outlaws who found the absence of formal law enforcement appealing. It was a community that operated on a barter system of stolen cattle and silence, a place where a young man with a quick smile and a faster gun could find a warm bed and a hot meal without questions being asked. The autumn of 1878 was a period of transition, a slide from the high-stakes combat of the siege into the grimy, opportunistic world of the rustler. Billy fell in with a rotating cast of characters, men like Tom O'Folliard, who worshipped the ground the kid walked on, and Charlie Boder, who remained a steadfast companion. They survived by preying on the massive herds of the cattle barons, particularly the stock of John Chisholm. Billy felt a deep, gnawing sense of entitlement regarding Chisholm's cattle. He believed the cattle king owed him wages for the fighting he had done, for the risks he had taken, and for the friends he had buried. When Chisholm refused to pay for the services of a gunman he had never officially hired, Billy decided to collect his due directly from the range. He told associates he would credit himself on the account, driving off steers and selling them to the butchers in Las Vegas, or the agents at the Indian reservations. Life in Fort Sumner was a sequence of bales, Monte games, and dusty rides under the moon. Billy was popular here, a local celebrity known for his fluency in Spanish and his courtesy to the women of the village. He was El Chivato, a figure of romance to the locals, but to the power brokers in Santa Fe, he was a festering sore. The violence of the war had officially ended, but the animosity remained, a live coal buried under the ash. The kid made occasional forays back into Lincoln, walking the streets like a ghost haunting the scene of his crimes. He was indicted for the murder of Sheriff Brady, a piece of paper that marked him for the hangman. Yet he moved with a brazen confidence, relying on the fear he inspired and the incompetence of the law to keep him free. In February 1879, the anniversary of John Tunstall's murder approached, bringing with it a desire for closure. On February 18th, a strange and drunken summit took place on the main street of Lincoln. The surviving adversaries of the war decided to call a truce. Billy, Tom O'Folliard, and others from the Regulator faction met with the enforcers of the Dolan faction, including the outlaw Jesse Evans and the gunman William Campbell. They drank heavily, swearing oaths of peace, promising to stop the killing and to stand together against anyone who tried to restart the trouble. It was a pact sealed in whiskey and desperation, a fragile agreement between men who knew no trade other than violence. That same night, the hollowness of the truce was exposed in a brutal fashion. Houston Chapman, a one-armed attorney who had been hired by Mrs. McSween to pursue legal action against the men who burned her home, arrived in Lincoln. Chapman was a man of principle, suffering from the delusion that the law protected him. He encountered the drunken mob of peacemakers in the street. William Campbell, fueled by alcohol and the arrogance of the Dolan victory, shoved a pistol against the lawyer's chest. He demanded to know who the man was. When Chapman identified himself, Campbell shouted a curse and pulled the trigger. The heavy slug slammed into the attorney, killing him instantly. His body collapsed into the dirt, the papers in his satchel spilling out. Billy watched the murder unfold. He had not pulled the trigger. It was Campbell's work, but his presence at the scene implicated him. The truce had lasted only a few hours before claiming another innocent life. The peace conference was a farce. The war was not over. It had simply devolved into senseless thuggery. The murder of Houston Chapman sent a shockwave through the territory that reached all the way to the governor's palace in Santa Fe. The new governor, Lew Wallace, was a man of significant stature, a former Union general and the author of the novel Ben-Hur. Wallace had been sent to New Mexico with a mandate from Washington to clean up the violence. He issued a proclamation listing the names of men wanted for the recent killings, and William H. Bonney was at the top of the list. However, Wallace was a pragmatist. He needed testimony to convict the killers of Chapman and to break the power of the Dolan faction. He knew the kid was the only man who had witnessed the crime and might be willing to talk. In March 1879, a secret correspondence began. Billy, tired of running and perhaps seeing a way to clear the slate, wrote to the governor. "I have no wish to fight anymore," he penned, his handwriting neat and legible. He offered to surrender and testify in exchange for a full pardon for his past crimes, including the murder of Sheriff Brady. Wallace, intrigued by the boy's audacity, agreed to a meeting. On the night of March 17, 1879, the meeting took place in the home of Squire Wilson in Lincoln. The general and the outlaw sat across from each other in the dim light of an oil lamp. It was a study in contrasts. Wallace, the bearded, distinguished statesman representing the federal government, and Billy, the 19-year-old fugitive with a revolver on his hip and the eyes of a hunted animal. Wallace made the offer clear. Billy would submit to a fake arrest to ensure his safety, testify before the grand jury against the killers of Chapman and the corrupt elements of the military, and in return, Wallace would use his executive power to grant a pardon. Billy listened, weighing the words. He desperately wanted to be William Bonney, citizen, rather than Billy the Kid, outlaw. He looked the governor in the eye and agreed to the terms. On March 21st, the staged surrender took place. Billy allowed himself to be taken into custody by Sheriff George Kimbrell and was housed in the root cellar of the patron Juan Patron, which served as a temporary jail. For the next 2 months, Billy held up his end of the bargain. He appeared before the grand jury in April, testifying with a clarity and precision that impressed the legal officials. He named names. He detailed the murder of Chapman. He implicated Colonel Dudley in the arson of the McSween house. He placed his own neck on the line, trusting in the word of the governor. But the political machinery of New Mexico was a grinder that chewed up promises. The district attorney, William Reinerson, was a staunch ally of the Santa Fe Ring and the Murphy-Dolan faction. He had no intention of letting a cop killer walk free, regardless of what the governor had promised. Reinerson maneuvered behind the scenes, blocking the pardon and preparing to prosecute Billy for the Brady murder. Governor Wallace, distracted by other administrative headaches and perhaps underestimating the vindictiveness of the local prosecutors, began to distance himself from the deal. Billy sat in confinement, watching the days tick by. He saw the killers of Chapman escape justice through jailbreaks or acquittals. He realized with a sinking heart that he had been played. The pardon was not coming. The law was not a system of justice. It was a trap. In June 1879, Billy decided he had waited long enough. He was being held in Lincoln with minimal security, as he was technically a state's witness. He simply walked away. He slipped out of his confinement, mounted a horse, and rode out of town. He did not run with the panic of a fugitive. He left with the disgust of a man who had tried to do the right thing and had been spat upon for his trouble. He headed back to the only place that felt like home, Fort Sumner. The return to the outlier life in the latter half of 1879 marked a shift in Billy's psychology. The hope for amnesty was dead. The governor had lied, the district attorney was an enemy, and the world wanted him dead. He embraced the outlaw identity with a fatalistic abandon. He gathered a new crew, a mix of old friends and a mix of recruits, including the rough-edged Billy Wilson and the dangerous Dave Rudabaugh. They focused their attention on the cattle herds of the Texas Panhandle and the Pecos Valley. Rustling became a full-time profession. The kid was no longer stealing to survive. He was stealing to prosper and perhaps to punish the men who owned the world. The winter of 1879 was cold and bitter on the plains. The wind howled through the cracks of the adobe houses in Fort Sumner. Billy spent his nights at the gambling tables, his face illuminated by the flicker of kerosene lamps. He was drinking more now, though never to the point of losing his edge. The locals still protected him, but the circle was tightening. The cattle barons, tired of the losses, were organizing. They were hiring detectives and pressuring the local sheriffs to take action. The name Billy the Kid was becoming a headline, a symbol of the lawlessness that stood in the way of progress and statehood. January 1880 brought the tension to a breaking point inside the smoky confines of Bob Hargrove's saloon in Fort Sumner. It was a place where the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed men. On the night of January 10th, a man named Joe Grant was holding court at the bar. Grant was a drifter from Texas, a man with a loud mouth and a mean streak when the whiskey was in him. He had been boasting all over town that he intended to kill Billy the Kid, claiming he wanted the glory and the reward. On this particular night, Grant was heavily intoxicated, bullying the patrons and smashing bottles. He spotted Billy in the crowd. Billy approached the man with his usual disarming grin. He did not posture or threaten. He played the role of the friendly local, trying to de-escalate the situation. Grant, swaying on his heels, looked at the small young man and sneered. He muttered threats, his hand hovering near the ivory-handled revolver on his hip. He called out that he was going to kill a man before the night was done. Billy, maintaining his smile, asked to see the Texan's pistol, admiring the weapon. It was a common request in the West, a way to diffuse tension by talking hardware. Grant, caught off guard by the boy's charm, handed over the gun. It was a fatal error. Billy held the revolver, a heavy Colt, and inspected it. In a move of practiced sleight of hand, he rotated the cylinder. He noticed that the hammer was resting on a live round. With a subtle click, he spun the cylinder so that the next chamber to rotate under the hammer would be empty. He handed the gun back to Grant, telling him it was a fine piece of machinery. The interaction seemed innocuous to the watchers in the saloon, but the kid had just rigged the game. Grant, emboldened by the return of his weapon and fueled by the alcohol, became more belligerent. He turned his aggression back toward the kid. He called Billy a liar and a thief. He shouted that he was going to send the kid to hell. The saloon went quiet. The music stopped. The other drinkers backed away, clearing a space around the two men. Billy stood relaxed, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his eyes locked on the drunkard's face. He told Grant not to do anything foolish. "I'll kill you!" Grant roared, and his hand flashed to his holster. He drew the ivory-handled Colt with a clumsy speed and leveled it at Billy's face. He pulled the trigger. The hammer snapped down with a loud metallic click. The empty chamber rolled into place. There was no explosion, only the sound of failure. A look of confusion washed over Grant's face as his brain tried to process the malfunction. In that fraction of a second, the gambler's grin vanished from Billy's face, replaced by the mask of the killer. He drew his own revolver, the motion a blur of efficiency that the eye could barely track. He did not hesitate. He fired a single shot. The bullet struck Joe Grant squarely in the chin. The impact was devastating. The heavy projectile smashed through the bone, tearing upward into the brain. Grant was dead before the sound of the gunshot had finished echoing off the adobe walls. He crumpled to the floor, his weapon clattering from his hand, a look of surprise frozen on his shattered face. Billy stood over the body, the smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. He looked at the dead man, then at the bartender. He did not offer an explanation or an apology. He simply holstered his weapon. He turned to the stunned crowd and made a quip about it being a shame that Joe Grant had unknowingly tried to kill the wrong man. He then walked out of the saloon into the cold January night, leaving the body cooling on the floorboards. The killing of Joe Grant was a signature moment in the evolution of the legend. It was not a battle in a war. It was a personal act of survival executed with a terrifying coolness. The newspapers would seize upon the story, painting the kid as a cold-blooded adder who struck without warning. They ignored the fact that Grant had pulled first. They focused only on the body count. To the public, the kid was becoming a monster, a figure of pure violence. For Billy, the incident was a confirmation that his time was running out. He had tried to make peace. He had tried to make a deal with the governor. He had tried to walk away. But the world kept sending men like Joe Grant to kill him. He realized that there would be no retirement, no quiet life on a ranch. There was only the gun, the road, and the inevitable end. The gambler's grin was a mask he wore to hide the knowledge that he was playing a game he could not win. The deck was stacked, the house was cheating, and the dealer was death. He mounted his horse and rode out of Fort Sumner, checking his back trail, knowing that the next man who came for him would not be a drunkard with an empty gun. The headlines were counting, and he was the one providing the numbers. November 1880 brought a bitter iron-gray chill to the New Mexico territory, signaling a change in the season and a darkening of the political horizon for William H. Bonney. The lawless vacuum that had allowed him to roam the plains of Lincoln and San Miguel counties was rapidly being filled by a new and formidable pressure. The cattle interests, tired of the bleeding profit margins caused by the rustling gangs, had consolidated their power and their money. They found their instrument of enforcement in the towering figure of Patrick Floyd Garrett. On November 2, 1880, Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County. He was a man who stood 6'4", a former buffalo hunter and bartender who knew the kid not from a wanted poster, but from the gambling tables of Fort Sumner. Garrett possessed a taciturn demeanor and a relentless drive that differed sharply from the incompetent or corrupt lawmen Billy had faced in the past. He did not bluster, and he did not threaten. He simply organized. He recruited a posse of hard men, promising them not just wages but a share of the glory in bringing down the most notorious outlaw in the Southwest. The atmosphere in the territory shifted from a chaotic free-for-all to a calculated manhunt. The kid, sensing the net tightening, continued his rustling operations, but the ease of the summer was gone. The weather turned against him, the nights dropping well below freezing, the wind sweeping down from the Rockies to scour the high plains. Billy and his diminishing circle of associates, Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Boder, Dave Rudabaugh, Billy Wilson, and Tom Pickett, moved constantly, sleeping in the open or in remote sheep camps, their breath pluming in the frosty air. They were no longer the kings of the county. They were prey, hunted by a machine that had unlimited resources and patience. The newspapers were clamoring for an end to the reign of terror, counting the days until the sheriff fulfilled his mandate. On December 19, 1880, the hunt converged on the familiar streets of Fort Sumner. Garrett, acting on intelligence that the kid was in the area, infiltrated the town under the cover of darkness. He did not ride in with bugles blowing. He slipped his men into the old military hospital building on the eastern edge of the parade ground. The structure, an adobe relic from the days when the army garrisoned the post, offered a commanding view of the road coming in from the east. The posse, including the veteran manhunter Barney Mason and the cattle detective Frank Stewart, hunkered down in the cold, unlit rooms. They waited in silence, rifles resting on windowsills, listening to the winter wind rattle the dry cottonwood leaves. The plan was a simple ambush. Wait for the gang to ride in for a night of gambling and whiskey and cut them down before they could clear leather. Around 8 o'clock that night, a heavy mist settled over the Pecos Valley, obscuring the moonlight and turning the world into a gray, indistinct blur. The sound of hooves crunching on the hard-packed snow broke the silence. The kids' gang was approaching, riding single file into the trap. Tom O'Folliard, Billy's oldest and most loyal friend from the regulator days, rode the point. O'Folliard was a Texan who had survived the 5-day siege and the chaotic years that followed, but his luck had run its course. He rode a horse that matched the description of the one usually ridden by the kid. A fatal coincidence in the dark and fog. As the riders neared the hospital building, the shapes of the posse men were invisible in the shadows. Garrett, watching the approaching silhouettes, shouted a command to halt. Before the echo of his voice had died, he rose and fired. The roar of his Winchester shattered the night. The heavy caliber slug struck O'Folliard in the chest, just below the heart. The impact lifted the rider in his saddle. O'Folliard groaned a terrible wet sound and clutched his torso. "I am killed," he gasped, his horse shying violently. The rest of the posse opened fire, the muzzle flashes tearing holes in the mist. Billy, riding further back in the line, reacted with the instinct of a survivor. He wheeled his horse around, shouting to the others to scatter. They spurred their mounts back into the darkness, the bullets of the lawmen singing harmlessly through the space they had just occupied. O'Folliard did not die instantly. He managed to keep his seat for a few yards before the strength left his body. He slid from the saddle into the dust of the road, the blood pumping from his chest in a dark rhythm. The posse ceased firing and approached the fallen man. They carried him into the hospital building, laying him on a table. The scene was grim and devoid of romance. O'Folliard, the boy who had ridden through hell for the kid, lay dying on a rough plank table while the men who shot him stood around, their breath visible in the cold room. He begged for water, cursing Garrett between gasps of pain. The internal bleeding was massive. Within 30 minutes, the light faded from his eyes and he went silent. The first of the inner circle was gone, a body to be tallied in the sheriff's report. Billy and the survivors fled into the night, demoralized and shaken. The death of O'Folliard was a hammer blow. They rode hard, putting distance between themselves and the fort, the wind cutting through their coats. A heavy snowstorm began to blow in, the temperature plummeting. The horses were exhausted, their coats rimed with frost. The gang made their way to the Wilcox Ranch, 12 miles east, seeking shelter and fresh mounts. They were desperate men, cold, hungry, and knowing that Garrett would be on their trail as soon as the sun rose. They did not stay long at Wilcox's, fearing the posse was close behind. They pushed on, heading for a remote sheep camp known as Stinking Springs. Stinking Springs was a desolate spot in the middle of nowhere, named for the sulfurous smell of the water that seeped from the ground. The only structure was a small, crude rock house built by a sheep man named Alejandro Perea. It was a fortress of sorts, built of stacked stone with a low door and no windows, situated near an arroyo that provided some cover. It was a trap, but it was the only shelter available in the blizzard. The gang arrived in the early hours of December 23, 1880. They unsaddled their horses, bringing 3 of them inside the small structure to protect them from the biting wind, while the other horses were tethered outside. They collapsed on the dirt floor, huddled together for warmth, the smell of wet wool and horse sweat filling the tiny space. They had no food, only the water from the spring and a few bags of grain for the animals. Garrett, relentless as a bloodhound, tracked them through the snow. He arrived at Stinking Springs before dawn on the 23rd with his posse. He saw the horses tied outside and the smoke curling from the rough chimney of the rock house. He knew he had them. This was not a town with civilians to worry about. This was a kill box in the wilderness. Garrett deployed his men in the arroyo, forming a semicircle around the door of the hut. They lay in the snow waiting for the light, their rifles trained on the single wooden door. The cold was excruciating, numbing fingers and toes, but the lawmen waited, fueled by the knowledge that the end was near. As the first gray light of dawn illuminated the stark landscape, movement stirred within the rock house. Charlie Bowder, the man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Billy since the killing of Tunstall, emerged from the low door. He was carrying a feed bag, intending to feed the horses tied outside. He wore a hat that resembled one the kid often wore. In the dim light, Garrett made a calculation. He signaled his men. As Bowder stepped into the open, Garrett raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck Bowder in the chest, the heavy impact spinning him around. He stumbled, dropping the feed bag, and fell back toward the door of the house. Inside, the gunshot woke the gang instantly. Billy scrambled to his feet, grabbing his revolver. Bowder crashed into the room, clutching his chest, coughing blood. He was finished. The wound was mortal, the slug having tore through his lungs. He gasped to Billy that he was dying and wanted to go out and face them. The situation inside the hut was chaotic. The horses were panicking, the men were shouting, and Bowder was bleeding out on the dirt floor. Billy, pragmatic to the point of coldness, knew that a dying man was a liability in a siege. He took Bowder by the arm. "They won't hurt you now, Charlie," he said, or words to that effect, and guided the stumbling man back out the door. He pushed Bowder into the line of fire, perhaps to clear the field of fire, or perhaps to let his friend die in the open rather than in the cramped, manure-smelling dark. Bowder staggered out into the snow, his hands raised feebly. He walked toward the arroyo where the posse lay hidden. He called out to Garrett, his voice weak and gurgling. "I am dying," he stammered. He took a few more steps and then collapsed face first into the frozen earth. His body twitched once, and then lay still. The second pillar of the kid's life was gone. Charlie Bowder, the hatter from Mississippi who had become a warrior, was dead in a pile of snow at Stinking Springs. With Bowder dead, the siege settled into a grim standoff. Garrett and his men poured fire into the rock house. The bullets sparked off the stones and splintered the wood of the doorframe. Inside, the gang was trapped. They returned fire, but they were shooting blind, aiming at the puffs of smoke from the arroyo. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The posse shot the ropes of the horses tied outside, hoping the animals would run off and leave the outlaws on foot. But one horse, a bay, was shot in the doorway. The animal fell half in and half out of the hut, its body blocking the only exit. The carcass froze quickly in the bitter cold, becoming a gruesome barricade that the men inside had to crawl over to see out. The sun rose higher, but it brought no warmth. The wind howled across the plains, driving the temperature down. Inside the rock house, the conditions were hellish. There was no food. The water was outside in the spring, covered by the guns of the posse. The horses inside were nervous and urinating, adding to the stench. Billy and his men, Rudabaugh, Wilson, and Pickett, huddled behind the stone walls, their eyes red from the dust and the strain. They were starving. They had not eaten a substantial meal in days, and the cold was sapping their energy. They discussed making a run for it, charging the arroyo with guns blazing. But the open ground was a death sentence. Garrett had them pinned. Around noon, the psychological torture began. The posse, comfortable in the arroyo with their supplies, started to cook a meal. The smell of roasting meat and brewing coffee drifted on the wind, wafting into the rock house. To the starving men inside, the scent was more painful than a bullet. It was a visceral reminder of their hopelessness. Garrett shouted to the kid, inviting him to come out and have some coffee. It was a taunt, but it was also an offer. The sheriff knew that hunger and cold were better weapons than his Winchester. He did not need to storm the fort. He just needed to wait. Inside, the resolve of the gang fractured. Dave Rudabaugh, a man who feared nothing when he had a gun in his hand, was broken by the passive agony of the freeze. He began to talk of surrender. Billy Wilson and Tom Pickett were silent, shivering in their coats. Billy Bonney looked around the small, dark room. He saw the fear in the eyes of his companions. He looked at the dead horse blocking the door. He thought of O'Folliard bleeding on the table and Boder freezing in the snow. He realized that the game was up. There was no chimney to climb, no back door to burst out of. This was a stone box and the lid was nailed shut. The conversation inside the hut was brief and bitter. They argued about fighting to the death, but the lack of ammunition and the overwhelming odds made it a suicide pact they were not willing to sign. The hunger was a physical pain, a cramping in the gut that overrode their pride. They decided to give up. They poked a dirty white rag on the end of a stick through the door, waving it as a flag of truce. The firing from the arroyo ceased. Garrett called out for them to come out one by one, hands high. The first to emerge was Billy Wilson, followed by Pickett and Rudabaugh. They crawled over the stiff carcass of the dead horse, their hands raised to the gray sky. They walked slowly toward the posse, their legs stiff from the cold. Finally, the kid appeared. He stepped out into the biting wind, his face gaunt, his clothes dirty and torn. He did not look like a legend. He looked like a starving boy who had run out of road. He walked to the arroyo and surrendered his weapons to Pat Garrett. The sheriff accepted the surrender with a professional calmness. There was no gloating, only the snapping of handcuffs. The posse moved in to secure the prisoners. They gave the starving men some food, the leftovers of the meal that had tormented them, and allowed them to warm themselves by the fire. The body of Charlie Boder was retrieved from the snow. It was frozen solid, the arms locked in the position of his last fall. The posse loaded the corpse onto a wagon alongside the prisoners. The group began the long, slow journey back to civilization. The ride to Las Vegas, the nearest railhead, was a funeral procession for the outlaw era. Billy sat in the wagon, shackled to Rudabaugh, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was alive, but his world was dead. O'Folliard and Boder were gone, the two men who had been his brothers in arms. The silence of the plains was heavy, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the chains. The newspapers would soon have their story, the capture of Billy the Kid. They would count the bodies of the gang members and celebrate the triumph of law and order. But for Billy, sitting in the cold December air, the math was personal. He had lost everything that kept him human. The rock house at Stinking Springs had been the tomb of his freedom. They arrived in Las Vegas on December 26, 1880. The town turned out in force to see the captured bandits. The crowd pressed against the jail wagon, jeering and shouting. Billy, regaining some of his composure, smiled at the onlookers, playing the role they expected. He joked with the reporters, offering a glimpse of the charm that had made him famous, but his eyes remained hard. He was a prisoner now, a caged animal waiting for the final act. The starvation at Stinking Springs had done what the guns of the Santa Fe ring could not. It had forced him to his knees. The counting of bodies paused, but the counting of days until the hangman's noose had just begun. January 1881 began with William H. Bonney shackled to the floor of a train car, the metal of the rails humming beneath him as the engine pulled him away from the defeat at Stinking Springs toward the judicial machinery of the territory. The capture had stripped away the mystique of the outlaw, leaving only a 21-year-old prisoner with wrists chapped by iron cuffs and a future that measured in months. He was transported eventually to the sturdy jail in Santa Fe, where he languished for 3 months, attempting to restart his correspondence with Governor Wallace. He wrote letter after letter, his penmanship neat and his tone increasingly desperate, reminding the author of Ben-Hur of the promises made in the dark room at Lincoln 2 years prior. But the governor had moved on to other political concerns, and the letters went unanswered, collecting dust in a bureaucratic pile while the prisoner paced his cell. The silence from the palace was a clear signal. The deal was dead, and the law intended to finish what the bullet at O'Folliard's heart had started. In late March 1881, the venue for the end of the game was set. Billy was moved south to Mesilla, a town steeped in history and dust, located near the Texas border. The trial was held in a building that served as both a store and a courthouse, a symbol of the commercial nature of frontier justice. The proceedings were overseen by Judge Warren Bristol, a man who barely concealed his disdain for the defendant. The prosecution was led by Simon Bolivar Newcomb, a relentless attorney who painted the kid not as a combatant in a war, but as a feral dog that had bitten the hand of society once too often. The specific charge was the murder of Sheriff William Brady. The defense was perfunctory, a legal ritual performed to satisfy the requirements of the docket rather than a genuine attempt to save a life. On April 13, 1881, the gavel fell. The jury delivered a guilty verdict. Judge Bristol, looking down from the bench, pronounced the sentence with a grim finality. The prisoner was to be taken to Lincoln and on May 13th be hanged by the neck until his body was dead. The transport back to Lincoln for the execution was a somber parade through the heart of the territory Billy had once roamed freely. 7 heavily armed deputies guarded him, a testament to the fear he still inspired even in chains. They arrived in Lincoln on April 21, 1881. The town had changed since the days of the siege. The House of Murphy, the massive adobe structure that had been the headquarters of the faction Billy fought against, had been converted into the county courthouse. It was a supreme irony that Billy was to be imprisoned in the very building that had symbolized the corruption he despised. He was housed on the 2nd floor, in a room that had once been a store office. The sheriff, Pat Garrett, took no chances. He assigned 2 deputies to watch the prisoner 24 hours a day, James Bell and Robert Ollinger. The dynamic between the prisoner and his keepers was a study in psychological warfare. James Bell was a quiet, decent man, a former miner who treated Billy with a basic level of humanity. He played cards with the kid, spoke to him without malice, and seemed uncomfortable with the grim duty of watching a man wait for death. Robert Ollinger was the opposite. He was a survivor of the 7 Rivers gang, a man who had fought against the regulators and held a deep personal hatred for the kid. Ollinger was a bully who used his position to torment the shackled youth. He would sit across the room cleaning his shotgun, a double-barreled Whitney breech-loader, and detailing exactly how the buckshot would tear Billy apart if he tried to escape. He drew lines on the floor with his boot, daring Billy to cross them so he could justify pulling the trigger. He loaded the shotgun in front of the prisoner, dropping the heavy shells into the chambers with a metallic clatter, telling the kid that the man who gets this load will feel it. For 7 days, Billy endured the confinement. He sat on a small chair or lay on a mattress, his hands cuffed and his legs secured with heavy irons riveted by a blacksmith. The mental pressure was immense. Outside the window, he could see the scaffold being erected, the timber frame rising against the spring sky. Inside, he had to listen to Ollinger's taunts. But behind the blue eyes and the casual demeanor, Billy's mind was working with the precision of a clock mechanism. He was analyzing the routine, looking for the single fracture in the security protocol that would offer a chance. He noticed that Garrett was out of town, collecting taxes in White Oaks. He noticed that Ollinger left the building daily across the street for meals, leaving Bell alone for short intervals. He noticed the layout of the stairs, the location of the armory closet, and the physical capabilities of his guards. April 28, 1881 began as another day of waiting. The sun was bright, warming the adobe walls of the courthouse. At noon, Robert Ollinger took 5 other prisoners across the street to the Wortley Hotel for lunch. He left James Bell alone with the kid. Ollinger carried his shotgun with him initially, but before leaving the room, he placed the weapon in the closet or leaned it in the corner, perhaps feeling that carrying it to lunch was unnecessary, or perhaps confident that Bell could handle the shackled youth. As the heavy boots of the bully faded down the stairs, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was the moment Billy had been waiting for. The kid asked Bell to take him downstairs to the privy located in the yard behind the courthouse. Bell obliged as he had done before. They walked down the stairs, the chains on Billy's legs clanking with every step. They exited the rear of the building, the fresh air hitting Billy's face. After the necessary business was concluded, they began the ascent back to the second floor. Bell walked behind the prisoner, a standard precaution. As they reached the top of the stairs, a flight of 18 steps that turned sharply, the timeline of history compressed into a few violent seconds. The exact mechanics of the initial move remain a subject of debate, but the result was indisputable. Billy, possessing hands that were small and flexible, may have slipped one hand out of the cuff, tearing the skin in the process. Alternatively, he may have waited until they were at the top of the stairs and used the heavy handcuffs as a bludgeon. With a sudden, explosive movement, he turned on Bell. He swung the cuffs or his fist, striking the deputy. Bell, taken completely by surprise, stumbled. A desperate struggle ensued in the narrow hallway. Billy, despite the leg irons, was faster and more desperate. He grappled for Bell's revolver, a heavy-caliber pistol holstered at the deputy's hip. Bell, realizing his fatal error, panicked. He broke away from the grapple and turned to run back down the stairs, perhaps intending to flee to the street to raise the alarm. It was a fatal decision. Billy wrenched the pistol free or retrieved a weapon he had secured from a hidden cache in the privy. As Bell plunged down the stairs, terrified and shouting, Billy leveled the gun. He fired a single shot. The bullet struck James Bell in the back, piercing his body and exiting the chest. The impact pitched the deputy forward. He tumbled down the remaining stairs, crashing into the walls, and collapsed into the arms of the startled Godfrey Gauss, the old courthouse janitor who was standing at the bottom. Bell groaned, stumbled out into the yard, and fell dead in the dirt, his blood staining the soil of the compound. The gunshot echoed through the town like a cannon blast. Across the street at the Wortley Hotel, Robert Ollinger froze. He knew that sound. It was not the accidental discharge of a rifle. It was the sound of a jailbreak. He dropped his fork and bolted from the table, running across the dusty street toward the courthouse. He did not draw his pistol immediately, perhaps assuming Bell had shot the prisoner. He ran toward the gate, shouting for the other guards. He heard the janitor yelling that Bell had been killed. Ollinger's face went pale. He knew who was waiting for him. Upstairs, Billy moved with a frantic, hobbling speed. He ignored the dead man at the bottom of the stairs. His focus was on the closet. He kicked open the door to the armory room and seized the prize he had been eyeing for days, Ollinger's double-barreled shotgun. The weapon was loaded with the buckshot shells Ollinger had taunted him with. Billy limped to the window that overlooked the yard and the street. He rested the barrels on the sill, the wood cool against his hands. He looked down and saw Ollinger running toward the building, his face twisted in confusion and fear. As Ollinger passed directly under the window, he heard a voice from above. "Hello, Bob." It was a casual greeting, a horrifying intimacy in the face of death. Ollinger looked up. He saw the twin black eyes of his own shotgun staring down at him. He saw the face of the boy he had tortured. There was no time to beg, no time to draw. Billy pulled the triggers. The shotgun roared, a devastating blast that unleashed a storm of heavy projectiles. The buckshot slammed into Ollinger's upper body and head. The force of the impact was catastrophic. It lifted the large man off his feet and threw him backward. He hit the ground dead, his body ruined by the very weapon he had promised would kill the kid. Billy stepped back from the window, the smoking shotgun in his hands. He broke the breech and threw the empty shells onto the floor, or perhaps he smashed the stock of the gun over the railing, breaking it in two and tossing the pieces down onto the corpse of Ollinger. "Take it, damn you!" he shouted, or words to that effect. "You won't follow me anymore with that gun." The rage that had been compressed for 7 days exploded in that moment. He had killed the kind guard out of necessity, but he had killed the bully out of pure, righteous hate. The town of Lincoln fell into a terrified silence. The 2 lawmen were dead in the yard. The most dangerous gunman in the territory was loose in the courthouse, armed and adrenaline-fueled. The citizens locked their doors and shuttered their windows. No one dared to approach the building. Billy was the master of the scene. He hobbled out onto the balcony, waving his pistol, shouting at the town. He was not fleeing in a panic, he was taking control. He demanded a file or a pickaxe to break his leg irons. He spotted the janitor, Godfrey Gauss, and ordered him to throw up a tool. Gauss, trembling, tossed a miner's pickup to the prisoner. Billy retreated back inside. For the next hour he worked on the shackles, the sound of metal striking. Metal rang out from the second floor, a rhythmic industrial noise that punctuated the silence of the death-filled afternoon. He could not cut the rivets of the ankle cuffs, so he worked on the chain that connected them. He managed to sever the link, freeing his legs to move independently, though the heavy iron rings and a length of chain still dangled from each ankle. He tied the loose ends of the chain to his belt to keep them from dragging and tripping him. He then turned his attention to his escape vehicle. He called down to the stable hand or the janitor to saddle a horse. He specified a pony belonging to the county clerk, Billy Burt. The horse was brought to the front of the courthouse. Billy armed himself heavily. He took a Winchester rifle and 2 revolvers from the armory. He filled his pockets with ammunition. He wrapped a blanket around himself. He was preparing for the wilderness, knowing that he would never be taken alive again. He walked down the stairs, stepping past the blood smear where Bell had fallen. He walked out the front door, the chains on his legs jingling softly. He stepped over the body of Robert Ollinger without looking down. He approached the horse. The animal, sensing the tension and perhaps smelling the blood and gunpowder, was skittish. It danced away as Billy tried to mount. The leg irons made the process difficult. He struggled, cursing softly, hopping on one foot, trying to get into the saddle while holding the rifle. It was a moment of vulnerability, but the town watched from behind curtains, too paralyzed to intervene. Finally, he managed to swing into the saddle. He settled himself, adjusting the guns on his belt. He looked up and down the empty street of Lincoln. This was the town where he had seen Tunstall murdered, where he had killed Brady, where he had been besieged in a burning house. It was a graveyard of his history. He turned the horse toward the west, toward the setting sun and the Rio Hondo. He did not gallop away, in a cloud of dust. He rode out at a slow trot, singing a song, some said, or perhaps just whistling a low tune. He was the king of Lincoln for one last hour. The escape on April 28th was the crescendo of the legend. It was a feat of impossible violence and audacity. He had been in the iron grip of the law, sentenced to hang, guarded by 2 men, and he had killed them both and walked out the front door. The newspapers would go insane. The story would travel across the ocean. The counting of bodies had reached a new, horrifying peak. Bell and Ollinger were numbers 20 and 21, depending on who was doing the counting. But the numbers didn't matter to the boy riding west. What mattered was the air in his lungs and the weight of the Winchester in his scabbard. He rode into the hills, disappearing into the rugged terrain that had always been his ally. He knew the hunt would be renewed with a fervor that would burn the territory down. Garrett would not rest now. The killing of the deputies was a personal insult to the sheriff. The state had been humiliated. There would be no more trials, no more jails. The next time they met, it would be the final time. Billy knew this. He could have ridden to Mexico, vanished into the Sierra Madre, and lived out his life as a vaquero. But he didn't. He stayed. He circled back toward Fort Sumner, toward the woman he loved, toward the fatal gravity of his own past. Behind him, the sun set over the Lincoln County Courthouse. The bodies of Bell and Ollinger were collected by the stunned townsfolk. The blood was scrubbed from the stairs and the dust. The shattered shotgun was taken as a souvenir. The empty cell stood open, the chains lying on the floor like the shed skin of a serpent. The bell had tolled for the deputies, but the shotgun had answered for the kid. The boy was free, but he was a ghost riding through a world that had already dug his grave. The reprieve was temporary. The clock was still ticking louder, now than ever before. May 1881 found the most wanted man in the United States drifting not toward the safety of the Mexican border, but back into the fatal gravity of the place he considered home. After the explosive violence of his escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse, where he had left 2 deputies dead in the dust and shattered the authority of the territorial government, logic dictated that William H. Bonney should ride south. The border was a few days' hard ride away, and beyond it lay the Sierra Madre, a labyrinth of canyons where a man with his skills could vanish forever. He spoke the language, he knew the culture, and he had the means. Yet he turned his horse east, toward the Pecos River Valley and the dusty, sun-baked plaza of Fort Sumner. It was a decision born of hubris, fatalism, and a deep emotional tether to the people who lived there. To the Hispanic sheepherders and poor farmers of the valley, he was not a cop killer or a bandit. He was a neighbor, a dancer at the bales, and a protector who stood against the Anglo cattle barons. They fed him, hid him in their sheep camps, and lied to the lawmen on his behalf. This network of support created a false sense of invulnerability in the kid. He believed he was untouchable in his own backyard, a ghost who could float through the walls of the establishment without being snagged. Throughout June 1881, the hunt for the kid intensified, driven by the humiliation of Sheriff Pat Garrett and the fury of the Santa Fe ring. Governor Lew Wallace, tired of the embarrassment, kept a $500 bounty on Billy's head, a sum that in those days was a fortune sufficient to turn friends into traitors. The newspapers mocked Garrett, painting him as incompetent for allowing the prisoner to escape, and the pressure on the tall lawman was crushing. Garrett knew that his political future and his personal reputation depended on one thing: a dead outlaw. He began to receive whispers and tips from the shadows. A letter arrived from a man named Brazil, or perhaps another informant in Sumner, suggesting that the kid was not in Mexico but was hiding in plain sight, sleeping in the houses of his friends and boasting that he would never be taken alive again. Garrett, a man who possessed the patience of a predator, gathered his team. He did not bring a large posse this time. A large group made too much noise. He selected 2 men: John W. Poe, a stoic deputy and cattle detective who did not know the kid by sight and thus was less likely to be recognized, and Thomas Kip McKinney, a local who knew the terrain. July 14, 1881 was a day of scorching heat in the Pecos Valley, the kind of heat that drove men into the shade and silenced the birds in the cottonwoods. Garrett, Poe, and McKinney arrived in the vicinity of Fort Sumner under the cover of darkness. They did not ride boldly into the plaza. They tied their horses in a grove of peach trees outside the settlement, moving on foot like specters. They lay in the tall grass in the orchards, watching the movements of the town, waiting for a sign. The air was thick with the smell of dust and ripening fruit, and the buzzing of insects was the only sound. They stopped a local resident, terrifying the man, but learned little of specific value other than the general sense that the kid was around. The town was quiet, the adobe buildings dark against the starlit sky. The locals had gone to bed, or were keeping their secrets behind shuttered windows. As the night deepened, Garrett decided to make a move. He knew that if the kid was in town, he would likely be staying at the home of a friend or a lover. Rumors placed him often at the home of Chelsea Gutierrez, or perhaps visiting Paulita Maxwell, the sister of the prominent rancher Pete Maxwell. The Maxwell house was the largest structure in Fort Sumner, a sprawling adobe building that had once served as the officers' quarters when the fort was an active military post. It had a wide porch that ran the length of the building and a wooden picket fence surrounding the yard. Pete Maxwell, the head of the household, was a wealthy sheepman, a friend to both Garrett and the kid, walking a dangerous line between the law and the outlaw. Garrett decided to question Pete directly. He reasoned that Maxwell, a man with property to lose, might be pressured into giving up the location of the fugitive. Around midnight, the three lawmen crept toward the Maxwell house. The moon was high and bright, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusty ground. They moved with extreme caution, their boots making no sound on the packed earth. When they reached the picket fence, Garrett left Poe and McKinney on the porch to keep watch. He told them to detain anyone who tried to leave or enter. Garrett then slipped through the open door of Pete Maxwell's bedroom. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn against the moonlight. Maxwell was asleep in his bed. Garrett approached the bed frame, a looming shadow in the blackness. He reached out and shook the rancher awake. Maxwell started, confused and frightened. Garrett sat on the edge of the bed, leaning close, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He asked Maxwell if the kid was in town. He needed to know where the target was sleeping. At that exact moment, fate orchestrated a collision of impossible timing. William H. Bonney was indeed in Fort Sumner. He had spent the evening at a dance or a social gathering and had retired to a room nearby, possibly at the Gutierrez home. He was hungry. The gnawing emptiness in his stomach drove him out into the warm July night. He wanted fresh meat. He took a butcher knife from the kitchen, a long, sharp blade used for dressing game. He removed his boots, preferring the comfort of his stocking feet, and put on his hat. He walked toward the Maxwell house, intending to carve a steak from a quarter of beef that had been slaughtered earlier and was hanging on the north porch of the Maxwell residence. He moved with a casual, bouncing gait, the walk of a young man who felt entirely safe in his surroundings. He was armed with a double-action Colt revolver tucked into the waistband of his trousers, the handle worn smooth from use. Billy walked through the orchard and approached the picket fence. As he stepped onto the porch, he saw two shapes sitting in the shadows. It was Poe and McKinney. They saw the small, slight figure approaching, hat pulled low, a knife in his hand. They did not recognize him. They assumed he was a servant or a local Hispanic worker. Poe, a stranger to the territory, did not know the danger he was in. He stood up. Billy, instantly alert, reacted with the speed of a startled cat. He jumped back, his hand flashing to his gun. "¿Quién es?" he whispered sharply in Spanish. "Who is it?" He did not fire. He was in the home of a friend. He did not want to shoot a neighbor or a guest by mistake. He backed away from the strangers, his revolver drawn but not leveled. He moved toward the open door of Pete Maxwell's bedroom, seeking the familiarity of his host. He stepped over the threshold into the pitch-black room, leaving the moonlit porch behind. He was now inside the very room where Pat Garrett was sitting on the bed. Billy moved softly across the floor in his stocking feet. He sensed a presence in the room, a heaviness in the air that was not just Pete Maxwell. He moved toward the bed, his left hand extending, perhaps to wake Pete, his right hand holding the revolver. "Pete," he whispered, his voice tense but controlled. "Who are those fellows outside? ¿Quiénes son esos hombres afuera?" Garrett, sitting on the edge of the bed, froze. He recognized the voice instantly. It was the voice he had heard over card tables and whiskey glasses for years. He saw the dark outline of the small man standing within arm's reach. He saw the dull glint of the moonlight catching the barrel of the pistol in the kid's hand. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The man he had been hunting for months had just walked into the trap of his own accord. Pete Maxwell, terrified that a gunfight was about to erupt over his sleeping body, whispered frantically to Garrett, "That's him." Maxwell then threw himself off the bed, rolling onto the floor and scrambling toward the corner of the room, desperate to get out of the line of fire. Billy heard the movement. He sensed the third person in the room. He stepped back, raising his pistol. "¿Quién es? ¿Quién es?" he demanded again, his voice rising slightly in alarm. He could not see Garrett in the deep shadow of the headboard. He hesitated. That hesitation, born of confusion and the darkness, was his final error. He was trying to identify a target in a room where he expected only a friend. Garrett did not hesitate. He did not speak. He did not call for surrender. He drew his revolver, a single-action Colt, from his holster. He remained seated to steady his aim. He pointed the weapon toward the voice and the silhouette. He pulled the trigger. The roar of the .44 caliber gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the bedroom. The muzzle flash illuminated the room for a split second like a lightning strike, freezing the scene in a strobe of violent white light. The terrified face of Pete Maxwell on the floor, the tall shadow of Garrett on the bed, and the small, surprised figure of the kid standing in the center of the room, his gun raised but unfired. The bullet struck Billy directly in the chest, just above the heart. It passed through his body, tearing through the vital organs and severing the aorta. The impact did not knock him backward. He collapsed where he stood as if the strings holding him upright had been suddenly cut. He fell face forward onto the floor, uttering a small, choked gasp. Garrett, blinded by the muzzle flash and deafened by the report, threw himself to the side, firing a second shot blindly into the darkness. The second bullet went wide, embedding itself in the washstand near the head of the bed. Garrett scrambled out of the room, bursting onto the porch where Poe and McKinney were waiting, guns drawn. "I got him," Garrett gasped, his voice shaking. "I think I got him." Inside the room there was a brief struggle, a gurgling sound of air escaping from a ruined chest, and then silence. The darkness returned, heavy and absolute. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the stagnant air, mixing with the scent of dust and fear. Pete Maxwell, still cowering in the corner, began to shout for a light. He scrambled out of the room, stepping over the prone body of the intruder. Someone brought a candle. A small, flickering flame was carried onto the porch and then into the bedroom. The lawman and the rancher crowded into the doorway, peering into the gloom. The light fell upon the floor. William H. Bonney lay on his side, his stocking feet twisted, the butcher, knife lying near his hand, his revolver nearby. He was motionless. The blood was pooling dark and thick on the wooden floorboards, soaking into the cracks. One of the men knelt down and turned the body over. The blue eyes were open, staring at nothing. The boy who had terrorized the territory, who had escaped the hangman and defied the governor, was dead. He was 21 years old. The shot had been perfect, a piece of grim luck for the sheriff and a sudden, violent end for the outlaw. There were no last words, no dramatic speeches, just a query in Spanish and a flash of light. The reality of the death was stark and brutal. The body was small, almost fragile-looking in death. The hands that had been so quick with a gun were now limp and useless. The legend had been reduced to a corpse in a bedroom. The sound of the gunshot had awakened the town. People began to gather outside the picket fence, their voices rising in a murmur of confusion and grief. When the news spread that El Chivato was dead, a wail went up from the women of Fort Sumner. They pushed past the deputies crowding into the room. They did not see a monster. They saw a boy they had fed and danced with. They wept over the body, cursing Garrett and his men. They took possession of the corpse, carrying it to a nearby carpenter's shop. The scene in the carpenter's shop was a surreal wake. The women cleaned the blood from his face and body. They dressed him in clean clothes, a borrowed shirt and trousers. They placed lighted candles around the body, the flames flickering in the drafty room. The men of the town stood outside, sullen and angry, while Garrett and his deputies kept a nervous watch, fearing a riot. The sheriff had won, but he was a pariah in the moment of his victory. He had killed the favorite son of the Pecos. The next day, July 15, 1881, a coroner's jury was hastily assembled. They viewed the body and the site of the shooting. They interviewed Maxwell and the deputies. The verdict was a formality. William H. Bonney came to his death by a gunshot wound inflicted by Patrick F. Garrett in the discharge of his official duty. It was a legal stamp on an act of ambush. The body was placed in a simple wooden coffin. The burial took place later that day in the military cemetery at Fort Sumner. It was a dusty, desolate patch of ground filled with the graves of soldiers and drifters. Billy was lowered into the earth next to his two fallen comrades, Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Bodger. The trio was reunited in the soil of the territory they had fought to control. The grave was marked with a simple wooden plank, the names scrawled in paint. There was no fanfare, no state funeral, just the thud of dirt on wood and the prayers of the locals. News of the death traveled fast. The telegraph lines hummed with the story. The newspapers in Santa Fe, Las Vegas, and New York ran the headlines. They counted the final body. They printed the sensational details, often embellishing the truth, turning the gritty reality of the darkroom into a melodrama of good versus evil. They called him a demon, a killer of men, a scourge. They did not mention the orphan who climbed the chimney, the boy who watched his mother die, or the young man who stood over Tunstall's body and swore revenge. They printed the legend because the legend sold papers. Garrett collected the reward, but he never collected the adulation he expected. The killing haunted him. He had shot a man in the dark, a man who had called him a friend in another life. The shadow of the kid would stretch long over Garrett's life, eventually consuming him as well. But for Billy, the struggle was over. The running, the hiding, the starving in the snow, it was all finished. The death of Billy the Kid marked the closing of a chapter in the history of the American West. The open range was being fenced. The railroad was bringing civilization and its laws. The wild chaos of the frontier was being tamed. The boy who refused to be tamed, who refused to submit to the corruption of the ring or the authority of the badge, had to be removed. He was a relic of a time that was expiring, a chaotic element in a world that demanded order. As the sun set on the grave in Fort Sumner on July 15th, the wind blew across the dry grass, carrying the dust of the plains. The counting of bodies had stopped. The headlines moved on to the next sensation. But in the adobe houses of the poor, in the songs of the vaqueros, and in the memory of the territory, the boy lived on. He had died in the dark, but he had burned bright enough to sear his image into the soul of the West. The would-be outlaw had become the eternal outlaw, and the counting of bodies was replaced by the counting of years, as the story of the kid outlived the men who killed him.